Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Spoken Gospel Podcast. Thank you for joining us for this special episode. We are looking at Palm Sunday today,
Yes.
the first day of Holy Week.
Yeah.
And Seth, why should everyone listening really care about Palm Sunday?
Well, Palm Sunday remembers the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem riding on a donkey as a rival king to Caesar and the Roman Empire. And I feel like that, saying that just that way, put more stakes on this moment that I've experienced growing up. I was like, oh, really? He's coming in as a rival king to the Roman Empire? Okay.
Yeah.
That is high stakes.
Yeah. Okay. I have so many questions about that
Yes.
because you changed my opinion about this text.
Okay.
And so I have lots of questions.
Yes.
But get me into this moment. Like,
Yeah.
what's Jesus been up to this point, and why is he coming into Jerusalem at this time?
I love the way that John tells the story.
Okay.
Because in John's gospel, he only records 7 miracles by Jesus. And the idea with those 7 miracles, they are 7 miracles of new creation, bringing life from the dead. Symbolic of the type of ministry and life and good news, the type of king that he'll be. He'll be a king that brings life from death. And he's just done his 7th and most climactic miracle, which was raising Lazarus from the dead. And before that, he fed 5,000 people with fish and loaves.
Yep.
He healed a paralytic. He's healed people born blind. He's done a whole bunch of stuff. And so after all these miracles, and at one point, after the feeding the 5,000, people try to force him to be king.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right?
So they're
So
picking up.
I see. That he is this figure that can solve their problems with their bellies. They're hungry.
Right.
And here's a king who's finally feeding us, unlike Rome and Herod.
Who take.
Who take.
Yeah.
He's a different kind of person. And then almost as if to confirm those messianic expectations, he rides into a donkey. He rides into Jerusalem riding on a donkey.
Okay.
And that's significant because...
Well, hold on.
Okay.
Before we talk about the donkey.
Yes.
I need to understand what you've just said.
Yes.
Because you said that Jesus has been doing these miracles, and 2 things are being communicated. One is that he is able to take the small things, the dead things that are insignificant, and turn them into miracles, life.
Yes.
So Lazarus from the dead, taking a few pieces of food and feeding 5,000 people.
Taking just plain water and turning it into delicious wine.
Yeah, the best wine.
Yeah.
Okay, so what he's doing in there, he's not showing off that he can do miracles per se.
Right.
He is communicating that God, he is God, works differently.
And he's come to inaugurate a new creation on the earth that brings life from the death, or even life through death.
Because most kings, most leaders, they lead maybe through killing. They lead
That's
through
right.
big things, big palaces, big armies. And Jesus is saying, I can take the small, even the dead things of the earth and create a different kind of kingdom through a different kind of strategy.
I think that's fair. And I mean, what is death but the ultimate weapon of empire?
Right.
To coerce its citizens to do right or to punish them for doing wrong.
And Jesus is saying, I can take the biggest weapon empire has and use it against them.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. And then the second thing you said is that...
Can I say that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe another way to say it is like, instead of motivating people through the use of the sword, he's motivating people with the promise of life. So Jesus has been doing all these miracles throughout his ministry, proving that his kingship will be built on life, not death.
Yes. Okay. So Jesus is building his kingdom based on life instead of the threat of death. And people, the second thing you said is people are picking up on this message he's sending, that he's this new king of a rival kingdom. And so you said that they're starting to be like, oh, well, if this is the anointed one, the promised one from the Old Testament, the Messiah, let's grab him and let's make him king by force. Let's let him be king and let him take over Rome and fight our fights. Because, I mean, if he can do this with a few pieces of bread, if he could turn water into wine, imagine what he could do with all the strength of Israel.
What could he do with all the mechanisms of government?
Right. We could really stick it to Rome with this guy on our side.
And significantly, Jesus runs away from that.
Right.
He runs away from that. And so there's a real sense in which if Jesus would have just continued doing miracles with all this messianic undertone, he could have lived a happy life.
Oh, totally.
As a prophet and miracle worker.
Right.
And it's not until this moment on Palm Sunday that the possibility of a quiet life for Jesus
is done.
Yeah. Because when he comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, he's not just saying things in the wilderness, doing random miracles in his hometown. He is confronting the political and the religious establishment of his day and making a rival claim to their authority. So it's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Okay, talk to me then about this donkey coming out of the donkey, because I've always thought, and I feel like I've been taught so many times that Jesus riding in on a donkey was a sign of humility and lowliness. And you're saying, no, this is an act of war as a rival king or something like that. And I'm like, I've not heard that before.
Yeah.
So walk us through the history and the background that makes you get to that point.
Well, basically, this is what King Solomon rode when he rode into Jerusalem after the temple and his palaces were built. During his coronation ceremony, he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. And he, as this wealthy, magnanimous, wise king, rides in on a donkey. And historically, a donkey was the traditional beast of kings. It wasn't
a big Clydesdale.
Not necessarily. A Clydesdale would have been a war horse.
Okay.
A horse was a weapon of war.
Yes.
So to come in on a donkey is kind of a flex, not a military flex, but one that says, I'm the king and I know it, and I don't have to conquer because I know I'm the king.
Yeah.
So he comes in riding on the traditional beast of kings because he knows what that will signal to the powers that be. Also, he does it to fulfill a prophecy given by Zechariah in Zechariah chapter 9, where God, through the prophet Zechariah, says that one day I will send someone, a king, to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, and he will save God's people.
Okay, so what's interesting about that is this difference between a war horse and a donkey.
Yes.
Because not only is it the traditional beast of kings that when a dignitary enters a city on a donkey, it is him saying, I have authority here.
That's right.
It's also significant that he's repeating the Solomon story after the temple and the palaces are built, because he's about to go to the temple. So he's claiming Solomonic, King David, Israel's authority.
That's right.
Over this land in this act. But the other thing that's really interesting to me is if he's not on a war horse, he's saying that the battle's already won.
That's exactly right.
Because the battle's yet to be fought with the religious establishment, with Rome, with death itself. So you would expect Jesus to be like, all right, let's go to battle.
Let's go to war.
Let's get on the war horse. Give me the Clydesdale.
Which is interesting because there's another Old Testament story that Jesus is tracking with. It's from 2 Kings 9, where King Jehu rides in and purges Israel of all of its idolatry. And he kills the Ahabic line, King Ahab, and all of his descendants.
Yeah.
He wipes Israel out of all their idolatry and greed and pride and murder. And what happens when he comes into Jerusalem? People take off their cloaks and he rides in on them. But Jehu's riding on a horse. So he came in as a war, an angry warrior against injustice and evil and corruption and the way idolatry. That's what he's doing.
Yeah.
But for the cloaks to come back out, they expect him to be Jehu, but he's coming in not on the war horse.
Right.
He's going to do what Jehu does, but without the war.
Without the war.
How does that happen?
Right.
And a fun detail I love in the story is that we're told in some of the gospel by some of the gospel writers that the donkey Jesus is riding on has never been ridden before. And the only time I'm aware of that is mentioned in Scripture is when a sacrifice would be offered on the altar.
I see. If you're going to offer the sacrifice, it has to be an animal that has never been ridden.
Never been ridden before. So you can't sacrifice a donkey, but that detail.
It's like they always want perfect sacrifices at the altar, and it's like, don't give me your Mustang after you've put 250,000 miles on it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So what's interesting then is there are all these messianic expectations. There are these warlike expectations. There is this real sense that Jesus is forsaking a life of the peaceful prophet doing miracles in the wilderness and in his hometown. And he's going to war, but he's going to war against Jerusalem on the back of an animal that could be sacrificed. So the reason why I think Jesus is humble is not because he's riding on a donkey.
I see.
But because of how he will wage war against the powers that be.
Because he's going to do it as a sacrifice.
That's right.
That is interesting. Yeah, man, you brought out a whole lot that I'm just like trying to catch on to. So it's like the Jehu thing is interesting, right? Because Jesus is about to ride into the temple and cleanse the temple.
That's right.
Which is what Jehu is doing. That's very interesting.
Yep, and he's going to do that
He's
tomorrow.
He's going to do that tomorrow.
Yep.
That's very cool. So I'm just like trying to track on all these things. But the one thing that I want to hear from you now on is what the people are saying. We talked about what they're doing. They're laying down their cloaks
and palm branches.
Okay, before we get to what they're saying, talk about, it's called Palm Sunday.
That's right.
What's the deal with the palm branches?
During several feasts in the Jewish calendar, you would hold something called a lulav.
A lulav?
Well, that's what they call it now. I don't know if that's what they called it back then.
I have a loofah. Is that the same thing?
Not the same thing. But it's basically a palm branch with some citrus fruits on it traditionally. Okay. And they would wave it as pilgrims would come in to worship at the temple.
I see.
So during these temple festivals, people would wave these palm branches and they would sing from the Psalms their pilgrimage songs on the way to the temple. And so a lot of times on Palm Sunday, people quote the really famous line, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the King of Israel. And they're singing this over Jesus as they're waving palm branches and laying their cloaks down. So it's really significant. The crowd is saying, Hosanna, which means save us.
Save us, Lord, we pray. Yeah.
Lord, we pray. Blessed is the King of Israel.
Yeah.
They're making a very public declaration that he is a rival king to the powers that be, mixing it with all the hopes of the Jewish festivals in which pilgrims would come to the temple to offer sacrifices, and claiming that Jesus is the one who's going to make it all work out somehow.
Jesus is the one who's going to save them, who's going to be the one who inhabits the temple, who fulfills all the hopes of their feasts.
That's right.
And
it's
just blowing me away, like
how much is going on right here.
Well, that and how fickle this crowd is going to be.
Right.
Yeah.
It is not clear how much this crowd understands the deeper significance that's happening. The way that Mark tells the story, it's almost as if they're treating Jesus as just another pilgrim. Because everybody would be singing these songs on the way to Jerusalem.
Oh my goodness, you're right. I've never thought about that. I was like, why are they here? How did they get? Did Jesus like send out a tweet?
Right,
he's like, hey, man, meet me on the road. I'll be on the donkey. Bring your palm branches. No. It's like, how did he orchestrate this event? It's like, man, we are the week of Passover.
Yeah.
Jerusalem would have been rammed with people.
That's right.
They would have been going through all of these feasts and preparations and welcoming pilgrims coming in from all over the world to come to the temple and offer their sacrifices to participate in Passover. And Jesus is just in the line of all the pilgrims. Right. And it's just the celebration's happening around him.
Right.
And they don't even realize that they are speaking these prophetic words over Jesus as the final pilgrim, the final Davidic king, the final one to arrive for Passover. That's blowing my mind. I've never thought of that before.
Yes, we don't know the full state of the crowd.
Sure.
Some probably are doing it with all the messianic hopes that we've set up.
Yeah.
Others are just doing it because everybody else is doing it.
Yep.
And this is kind of also what you do on Palm during Passover.
Yeah, that's right.
He's just another pilgrim. And that's the way when Mark tells the story, when Jesus finally gets to the temple, nothing happens. It's this really anticlimactic moment. Jesus walks in the temple, looks around, and then goes to sleep.
He goes back to Bethany.
That's right. And so it's interesting.
Right.
But that is all the meaning and significance that this day is carrying. Jesus is a rival king to Roman power. He's going to build a kingdom based on life rather than the wielding of death. He's going to do so as a sacrifice for his people in fulfillment with the prophecies. And he's doing it in such a way that will guarantee the ire of the religious establishment and Rome, forcing his death in the end.
Okay, so now you've kind of touched on like, okay, why is all of this good news for us here? So why is Jesus riding in as a rival king? Like, who's he riding against? What's the purpose of that? And why is that good news for us today, and or even for people of Jesus' day?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, like Jesus is coming to disarm and dethrone the evil empires of the world, take away the power of death, and replace it with a kingdom of life. Like on the most meta of levels.
Right.
That's what he's going to come into.
And I guess that's coming from the idea too that we have to understand the kingship thing that's happening here.
Yes.
That Israel is without a king. They do not have a king. But back in the golden era, it was David, King David, right. And God made a covenant with him. And he said, one of your descendants will sit on your throne forever.
That's right.
And I will make an eternal kingdom out of him. And there will be peace and equity on all sides.
Right.
And Israel's not there right now. And they've been waiting to see if God is going to be faithful to that promise or not. And so for a king to be riding in is a big deal, whether people are noticing it's happening or not.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus is riding in as the new king from David's line, a lot is happening there. And it's a threat, as you're saying, to Rome, who is currently occupying Israel,
right,
and overseeing it, taxing it. They're like the new Babylon.
Right.
It's a threat to the religious establishment that you brought up.
Yeah.
Right.
Caiaphas, the high priest, was elected or given his position by Rome. The Roman governor gave him that position. So his power among the Jews is related to Rome. And it's going to be the religious establishment that drives the crucifixion of Jesus.
Right. And that's probably two things happening there. You've got kind of one loose group that we could maybe call the Sadducees, and they've just gone in bed with Rome. They are just completely Hellenized in the Greek culture. They've been basically put there by Roman authorities, and they don't want to see their privileged position ruined by some king of the Jews coming and ruining their political relationship, and they would lose their sense of power. The Pharisees, on the other hand, aren't necessarily as pumped about Rome, but they want a king who's actually going to come and bash some skulls, do things the way that they think need to be done. And this king is not doing it the right way. He's talking about being a sacrifice. He's talking about destroying the temple. And these Pharisees are like, what's going on? This is not the king that we wanted.
Yes. And Jesus, right after he rides into the temple in John's account, starts talking about the necessity of his death. He must die.
Right.
And then it launches a whole string of arguments with the biblical scholars of their day saying, no, the Messiah can't die. That's not what the Messiah is supposed to do. So there is this long string of arguments that happen in John's gospel and all the other gospel writers as well about what is the nature of the Messiah? How has he come to rule the earth? And Jesus says, I'm not coming the way that you expect.
Right. Okay. I think I understand how all that's playing on the political and religious landscape of the day. Let's jump forward 2,000 years to those of us celebrating Palm Sunday today. And why is Jesus riding in on a donkey to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago good news for me today?
I mean, the news that our kingdom, the one that we reside in, America, China, wherever, is not the final or ultimate kingdom. Is pretty powerful good news. I'm not ultimately a citizen of where I live.
Right.
Not ultimately at the whims of the powers that be that wield death. But I belong to a new kingdom with a king that is promised to rule by and with and motivating through life-giving power and promises life even after death. We know that part of what that kingdom means is the working of smaller scale resurrections and new life, like healing. I'm sure you guys can tell my voice is not 100%, but part of the new kingdom is living in a world where God answers the prayers of people who are weak and failing and heals people's bodies. There's a new order that is not the same or operates on the same principles as the place we currently live. And that's really good news. And we belong there, and that is increasingly becoming a reality as we live.
I think, too, I'm hit with the good news of the fact that Jesus is a king who comes. Right? That there's been all this expectation ever since, and even before David, of a king who would come and bring equity and peace and hope and harmony, would actually rule well. And, they waited for it. Zechariah waited for it. The people of God were waiting for it in Jesus' day. And then God becomes flesh. That's the Christmas story that we celebrated a while back. And now in the Easter story, that God is coming to us to rule us as king. And what kind of king is he? Humble and lowly, riding on a donkey.
He's not a king like the religious establishment in Rome who will continue to try to preserve their power, but he's a king who comes ready to sacrifice his power for the sake of his people.
Yeah, and that's the kind of king we need.
Yes, that's the kind of king we need.
Yeah, that's good. I think as we close, I would say one other bit of good news that I can kind of see in this is whether it was on purpose or happenstance, the prayer that the people were praying over Jesus, shouting over him as he arrived. Hosanna, save us, Lord, we pray. We can pray that right now, right?
That's right.
We can shout that out on Palm Sunday today, and Jesus answers that prayer. He comes to us just like he came into Jerusalem. We can say, save us, God. We need you to save us. And Jesus comes. He saves. He arrives. He rules. And I think that's really good news that God answers our prayers, and the way he answers them is with Jesus.
Amen.
Amen. Okay.
Well, that's Palm Sunday.
That's Palm Sunday. What's tomorrow?
Tomorrow is Holy Monday.
Yeah.
So Jesus come in on a donkey, and the first thing he does once he comes into Jerusalem is arrive at the temple and start. Well, first he made a homemade whip, and then he started turning tables over.
Yes.
So that's what happened.
Cleansing of the temple, turning over tables, whipping people. That's tomorrow.
That's tomorrow.
All right. Well, tune back in tomorrow, everybody, for Holy Monday. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you tomorrow. All right, well, welcome everyone to Holy Monday. This is the second day of Holy Week. Yesterday we looked at Palm Sunday. Today is Holy Monday, the day that Jesus cleanses the temple.
Yes.
Right?
That's
right.
right.
So Seth, why should everybody be really excited about our conversation here?
Oh man.
For Holy
well,
Monday?
if Jesus making a homemade whip doesn't get you
I mean,
excited,
that'll do it.
Jesus is coming in we said last time, as a rival king.
Right. He rides in on a rival king.
Power. And very specifically here, he's coming into the temple as a rival to the temple system and the system the religious establishment are currently running in Israel.
Okay. Is it fair to say that like Palm Sunday was maybe more political and Holy Monday has more of a religious side to it, being at the temple?
Potentially.
But there's also...
I think that potentially.
Okay.
I think potentially.
Okay.
But what's interesting is the only way the religious establishment can actually get Jesus killed is by pretending his political ambitions were higher than they were.
Oh,
they have
hilarious.
to claim he's calling himself the king of the Jews, even though he never said that. All their problems with him are based around preserving their power in Israel at the time, whether that's of the temple itself or their relationship with Rome. But they have to give Rome a good reason to kill Jesus, so they're pulling on all these messianic hopes that he never claimed for himself. But when he talks to Pilate later, he says, of course, my kingdom is not of this earth. And then Pilate says, yeah, you're right. You're not guilty.
Right.
Anyway.
But in a sense, Jesus is being a king, right? He's fulfilling the Solomonic entrance that we talked about yesterday as he's riding in on the donkey. He's coming as Jehu on the laid down cloaks of the people to come and tear down idolatry.
That's right.
And it's like he's being a king. And so it's interesting that when Jesus the king rides into town, he goes straight to the temple, right? And I would kind of expect that in this time, and even as a pilgrim coming to Jerusalem for Passover, whether you were the king coming home from a conquering battle or you're just a sojourner on your way into Jerusalem, what you should do is you come into Jerusalem and you go to the temple and you make a sacrifice to God.
That's right.
That's what you would do. As the king, you would do it as a way to say thank you to God for your victory in battle that you're coming in from. Or as a pilgrim, you would come in, I'm in Jerusalem, let me get my animal and make a sacrifice. Now I can enjoy my Passover week.
Yes.
But Jesus doesn't make a sacrifice. He actually does the opposite. He stops the sacrificial system for a second. He comes in and he starts...
Well, specifically, he stops the buying and selling of animals inside a place called the Court of the Gentiles.
Okay, let's talk about the Court of the Gentiles for a second.
So this was somewhat of an innovation as the temple developed.
So this wasn't in the Exodus map out of how the tabernacle or temple was supposed to be built.
No, it wasn't. But this was the place designated by the religious establishment where Gentiles, people of non-Jewish descent, could worship God and pray and worship.
Right. And I remember that you have the Court of the Gentiles, and then you have another court where you had to be a Jew to go into.
That's right.
And I think Paul got in trouble for being accused of bringing non-Jews into that part.
That's right.
So you have this extra layer of buffer for Gentiles to live in and work in. And
so already the temple isn't operating as it should be.
Okay.
There should be a space where all people can come and not be separated from access to God and the ability to offer a sacrifice.
Okay, because in the outer court where everybody's allowed to come,
that's right.
You're saying that there's not a law in Exodus or anything that says that
Jews and Gentiles must be separated.
Okay.
So that's an innovation by this religious establishment.
So they've added a separate layer
to exclude Gentiles. And then Caiaphas, along with his father-in-law, set up a new innovation in which they started selling animals inside the court of the Gentiles.
I see.
Which would have meant money changing, haggling, a livestock market, manure, loud animals, basically making the court of the Gentiles no longer a functional place of worship.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And what they're doing there is they are trying to provide a service that the law actually required.
Right.
The law said, hey, if you live really far away and you can't bring your animal all the way from where you live to the place of sacrifice, bring some money.
That's right.
When you get to Jerusalem, buy the animal.
That's right.
And sacrifice it. That's totally fine.
Yes.
So the idea of buying an animal for sacrifice
not wrong.
is actually provided in the law.
Right.
But what you're saying is that where that maybe would have happened outside the temple, and actually that economic system might have benefited a lot of the Jerusalem inhabitants.
Right.
Caiaphas has centralized.
That's right.
That economic system to gain power over it, and not only that, he's brought it into a place of worship and prayer.
That's right.
And he's turned that into this place of market.
That's right.
Okay.
And so it makes it impossible for Gentiles to worship God functionally.
In any kind of reverential way.
That's right.
It's not a holy environment that they're in there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of scholars will also point out, like, there might have been something shady going on as well with the way in which these things were being sold. Maybe they were extorting, maybe they were price gouging, maybe they were taking advantage of the poor. The textual evidence is a little sparse, but what we know of the Pharisees and the Sadducees from elsewhere in Scripture seems to make sense of that interpretation. Regardless, when Jesus comes into the temple and starts knocking over things, he says in the book of Mark, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, and you have made it a den of robbers. So instead of a place of worship for all people.
So he's picking up on that Jew-Gentile divide there.
That's right.
Okay.
You have made it a place to hoard wealth for yourself at the expense of the nations.
Yeah.
So he's undoing the temple. He's criticizing the temple because it is failing its purpose to be a light to the world. Right. And be a place where everyone can be thankful to God and receive forgiveness for their sins.
And this seems to have always been happening. Even like from day one that the temple was founded, someone always seems to be messing it up. It's like almost never seemed to run exactly perfectly. Even Aaron's sons, like the first high priest, they in Leviticus they're told that they brought strange fire. They did something wrong. And
God's priesthood doesn't have a great track record of doing what God intended for them to do.
And I'm even thinking of like a lot of them. Let's look at the major prophet, Jeremiah, who's quoted here. He quotes Jeremiah 7, that you've turned my house into a den of robbers. That's from Jeremiah 7. And Jeremiah is critiquing the same thing. He's standing at the temple gate in Jeremiah 7. And as people are coming in, streaming past Jeremiah with their sacrifices and to go about their praise, he's critiquing them and basically telling them, what you're doing is all religious jargon and you're just going through the motions, and God's not accepting your sacrifices. Like,
that's right.
You've like what's happening at the temple is fundamentally broken. And so Jesus is pulling on this long-standing prophetic thread from Jeremiah all through the minor prophets, and he's saying something has to change.
That's right.
At the temple.
That's right.
It's kind of always been wrong. But what's interesting is it's not temple reform, right, that he offers, which is what the prophets have always said.
Like meaning, okay, all we need is the right priest and the right leadership.
Come on, priest, repent.
And let's get it right.
Jesus is like, here's what we're going to do instead. We're going to shut it down.
And the reason why we can get there is because you're right. How do people offer sacrifices? They've been traveling for 100 miles by buying it while they're in Jerusalem. But if he's shutting down one of the few places you can actually buy it, you're functionally shutting down the sacrificial system for a time.
Just for a moment.
And you're saying, no more of this.
Right.
And you're like, well, this isn't just a critique of the potential injustice of them. This is a stopping of the God-ordained means by which all nations can be forgiven and have access to God.
Right. And so if Jesus is coming in and he's saying, shut it down, no more sacrifices. Well, I mean, what are you going to do? How are all nations going to be reconciled to God if they don't have sacrifices for their sins? And what's interesting is, as we noted yesterday with Palm Sunday, Jesus is riding in on a beast that's never been ridden before. It's a sacrificial symbol. And once he stops all sacrifices, who's standing there? It's Jesus. He's saying, I will be the sacrifice. I will be the one who's going to facilitate as both sacrifice and priest what is actually supposed to happen in this temple.
Right. And we said before that when Jesus comes in on a donkey, he's repeating the Solomon story.
That's right.
And so what's interesting is when he comes in the temple, he throws down all these money changers, all the poor and the lame and the blind in this space, all recognize Jesus as a messianic figure. The children start saying, blessed is the son of David, which would have been Solomon, right? Or Jesus himself. And what does Solomon do? He built a new temple.
Yes.
So,
and as soon as Jesus leaves the temple here, he's going to talk about destroying the temple.
That's right.
Yep.
This is exactly right. So he even calls it my house.
Yes.
Which is kind of like a shocking statement.
Right. And he's quoting, but it's a wink.
But it's a wink, especially when you start just poking the eye of the religious establishment and saying, what you're doing is wrong.
My house shall be called a house of prayer.
Shall be called a house of prayer. It's like, and which is exactly what the religious establishment picks up on, because the next several chapters is all questioning what authority do you have to say anything that you've just said?
Yeah, who do you think you are coming in here saying my house?
Tell these children to stop calling you a son of David.
He's like, from the mouth of babes.
Right, that's exactly right.
That's good.
Exactly right.
Okay, so Jesus stops the sacrificial system, brings judgment against the temple system, as prophets have always done. Says that he's the new sacrifice.
That's right.
Not says, but prophetically demonstrates that he's the new sacrifice. But then also, as we're saying now, not only is he the new sacrifice, is he the new prophet, bringing rebukes against the broken temple system. He then, in shutting down the sacrificial system for a second, leaving the temple and then saying it's going to be destroyed. He's saying that there's going to be a new temple, like Solomon built a new temple.
That's right.
But he's going to say that it's the temple of his body.
That's right.
So he's also the new temple.
Yes.
Because this one's going down.
So,
which is really interesting too, because as he was riding in on this donkey, as you said yesterday, as a new rival king, it's interesting that he is also, and I'm going to go real nerdy here, he's also like a new king of Babylon riding against Israel's temple to destroy it.
That's interesting.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
Which is what the prophets all predicted.
That
would happen.
Would come in.
That's right. So Jesus rides as king against the temple, says, I'm going to destroy it, and I'm going to build a new one. But that new one is going to be my resurrected body.
So, like with all things during Holy Week, all these events are packed with so much symbolic meaning.
So loaded.
So, why is it good news that Jesus replaces the sacrificial system? Why is it good news that he's a new temple? And why is it good news he knocks over the tables in the court of the Gentiles? I think those are like the three categories we set up.
I'll take one.
I'll take one too.
Okay.
And we'll split the second one.
Okay.
The third one.
Which one are you taking?
I'll take the tables.
Okay, great.
We've already established this. The tables were in the wrong place. They should not have been preventing non-Jews from accessing God's goodness, his grace, his life-giving power, and his forgiveness. Jesus comes in and says, no, I will build a new house for God's people that will include all people. It will not be built off the ethnic divisions of your current religious establishment. I'm building a global kingdom,
right,
where all people are invited and all people can access God.
So you're saying it's good news that no matter where you come from, no matter what your background is, you can have equal access to God in Christ.
And it will not be hamstrung by corrupt priests.
Right.
It will not be hamstrung by a ruling class guarding access to God's presence.
Right.
God's presence is available for all people at all times, anywhere, through Jesus.
Yes. And then let's talk about why it's good news that Jesus interrupted the sacrificial system, right? Because, I mean, you look at the sacrificial system, and we have to understand first and foremost, which I think is hard for a lot of us to do, that it was an act of grace. That God provided access to his presence in the temple, in the tabernacle, through substitutionary atonement. Like, what a gift of grace.
Right. Because God was living in Israel.
Yeah.
He lived in the temple.
And he's like, I want to keep dwelling with you.
I want to keep staying here.
Yeah.
But in order for me to stay here, all sin
has to be atoned for.
Must be wiped out, must be cleansed, must be atoned for.
And in order for my presence to be with you.
And so the way that we're going to do that, it's the way that I can stay with you, the way I can be with you always.
Yeah.
Come and offer the sacrifice at the temple.
Right.
And then all will be forgiven.
So God provided a way for him to dwell with his people.
That's
amazing act of grace. I don't want to like demonize the sacrificial system. But look at even how Hebrews describes how difficult and repetitive and almost mundane that system was. The priests had to do it every day, over and over again, right? If you read Leviticus and you look at all the infractions that you can you can rack up, it's like, well, got to do another sacrifice.
Yeah.
You know, it's just this constant system of atoning for your sins.
That's right.
So that you can be in God's presence. And when Jesus puts a stop to that, and the clatter in the temple rests for a second, and all you see is Jesus, the final sacrifice, standing above it all, I just get this picture of rest. And it's like, it is finished. Yeah. And like Jesus being the final sacrifice brings finality and rest and a conclusion to that. And so now there's no longer any toil. There's no other sacrifice to make. There's no other work to do. There's no other sojourn to go on. Jesus is the final sacrifice so that we can be present with God. So I think that's why it's good news, is that there's nothing else to do. Jesus has done it all.
And what did sacrifice do? Sacrifice made it possible for God to remain with his people.
Yes.
And now he's saying, I will offer the sacrifice necessary to remain with my people always.
Yeah.
No more of this. I'm providing the sacrifice myself, and it will be available to you always.
And I love, too, that the people he makes it available to, the people who come around him after he clears the temple, are those who had traditionally been kept out of the temple. Like, you know, the lame and the disfigured.
That's right.
You know, they kind of had to... had some exclusion happening.
Right. They probably would have only been allowed in the court of the Gentiles.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. And then the poor, what if they couldn't afford the high prices to even get a little bird to sacrifice?
Right.
You know, and Jesus like, I'll be your sacrifice. Come and buy without money. You know, it's just this amazing thing that Jesus is providing the final rich sacrifice for the poorest and the outcast, and it's finished.
The final thing we said was
the temple.
And I think we've hit on a lot of what was a temple for.
Yep.
A place in which God's presence could live,
and
a place in which you could remain close to God by offering sacrificing.
It's a place where the Garden of Eden could come back.
Right. And so apart from that, though, the temple of Israel was always prone to corruption.
Right.
And whenever you have a system run by humans,
a centralized locus of power,
you will always have corruption.
That's right.
You will always have something go wrong. Jesus promises to make it impossible for his new temple to be corrupted again. He's building, and we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit tomorrow, but like an indestructible, incorruptible church in himself.
Yeah.
And that's the new religious order that's replacing the one that Jesus wrote against.
It's good.
So
that is Holy Monday. Jesus clearing the temple. Tomorrow is
Holy Tuesday.
Holy Tuesday. What happens on Holy Tuesday?
Jesus curses a fig tree and then says, if you want to curse your own fig trees, you have to have a lot of faith.
Yeah, and if you can throw a mountain into the water.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about what that means.
Okay, I'm excited. Well, thank you all for joining us on Holy Monday. We'll continue our walk through Holy Week tomorrow with Holy Tuesday. We'll see you then. All right, well, welcome everyone. Today is Holy Tuesday, and we are going to be talking about Jesus cursing the fig tree.
Right.
I mean, two weird things there that I don't often say. Curse and fig tree.
Right.
But tell us why we should be very excited about this.
This is probably one of the more strange stories in the Holy Week narrative, and an interesting thing to focus on for an entire day.
Sure.
Different religious traditions kind of lump this in with the temple cleansing, and that's probably they celebrate both the cleansing of the temple and the cursing of the fig tree in the same day.
Yeah, because they have similar themes.
They have very similar themes. And I think that's the most important thing for people to understand about the fig tree is that it's not a tutorial on how to throw mountains into the ocean to wither your own fruit trees in your backyard, but it's actually about the temple and everything that Jesus has done already. So that's the big idea that's happening. Right
so then if we're saying that you're going to want to understand the fig tree in light of what's just occurred at the temple.
That's right.
Why don't you give us a quick synopsis of what just happened in the cleansing of the temple?
Yes. So we talked about on Palm Sunday how Jesus had spent his entire ministry proclaiming that he was the king of life over death.
And he was doing that, we said, through his miracles.
Raising Lazarus from the dead. And as this king who has the power over death, he comes, rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, the beast of kings, to challenge the imperial establishment of Rome and the religious establishment of Israel and say, I've come to do something new. Tearing down your old kingdoms, I'm tearing down these old religious institutions, and I'm building something new in myself.
Yeah.
And so he's coming, challenging the powers that be, saying, I'm setting up something new. I'm a new sacrifice. I'm a new temple. I'm a new king. All the people in power are getting mad. And then Jesus walks away from the temple with his disciples.
Okay. And he walks out and he comes up on a fig tree.
That's right.
That has a leaf.
Yeah, he sees it from a distance.
It's in leaf.
And he sees a whole bunch of leaves on it.
And he's like, oh, I'm a little hungry after I just built a whip and made a prophetic stance in the temple.
Yes.
I'm going to go grab some fruit from this tree.
That's right. And as he walks up to it, he finds no fruit on it. And he says, I curse you, fig tree, wither and die. Now, depending on which gospel writer you read, Mark, for example, puts that story before Jesus goes into the cleansing of the temple and then records what happens next afterwards.
Right.
So you actually read the cursing of the fig tree as an analogy for or a metaphor for what he's doing in the temple.
Yeah.
But a lot of the other gospel writers will just put it all together.
Yeah.
Curses the fig tree, and then it withers down to the root immediately. It's kind of intense. So the question's always like, why on earth would Jesus do this?
Right. It's like, I've heard some people say, like, is he just mad? Is he hangry that he didn't get lunch that day?
Right.
It's like, no, he's doing a lot of what he did in the temple. He's making a prophetic metaphor, a prophetic demonstration, and he's communicating a truth.
Yes. So he's placing himself intentionally in line with a whole bunch of the Old Testament prophets.
Okay.
So if you go back and read the Old Testament prophets, what you'll find is one of the most common metaphor the major and the minor prophets have for the corrupted religious institution of the temple is of like an infertile fruit tree or an infertile vine. Micah 7 is really famous in this regard. Micah is lamenting the state of Israel. He's like, I'm looking around like a fruit picker after the harvest. I find nothing
on the vine.
Nothing on the vine. No justice is being done. Everything is being abandoned.
Right. I came to a place that's supposed to be bearing fruit, and I found no fruit.
So the idea of something that's supposed to be bearing fruit but isn't is a common metaphor among the prophets for a corrupted religious institution. So what Jesus is doing in this moment is he is making physical, real, and living, or dead in this case,
an old literary metaphor.
A metaphor the prophets have used for decades and decades and decades.
Yeah.
So when he curses the fig tree, he's claiming that just like the prophets of old, Israel's religious institution, the temple itself, is corrupt. And I am cursing it.
Okay.
I'm ending it.
So what would you say then is the fruit that he was expecting, or that God has always been expecting to be on the tree of Israel?
Yes.
And why is it not on the tree?
Yeah, the Old Testament prophets kind of have a whole bunch of different things, but probably the best categories is like loving God and loving people.
That's a good one.
So like the priests were meant to facilitate a loving relationship with God through sacrifices, and that was being subverted for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And they were supposed to love others by being the administrative center for justice in the land of Israel.
Right.
And that failed in the Old Testament. And similarly, the religious establishment of Jesus' day
was failing also.
Yeah, they were failing as well. They were not doing justice to the poor of the land, nor were they loving God rightly. And so Jesus is saying, your time is up.
Yeah.
The temple institution must fall.
It's interesting, the use of fruit and like barren trees and everything like that throughout the history of Israel as a prophetic symbol for this, because one of their original original tasks given to the people of God was to be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah,
right. To be fruitful was what it meant to be in God's image. Yeah. And to take that image around the world. And so obviously it's like, okay, this is your original commission, Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Right. Let me check back in on my people. How are they doing? Well, they're not being fruitful. Yeah. So it makes sense of the metaphor.
Yeah, there's more. There's layers, all the way back to Genesis.
Right.
Like what is a tree and what is fruitfulness in God's covenant plans throughout all of human history.
Right.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is the people of Israel were supposed to be a light to the nations, right? They were supposed to
particularly the temple establishment. The temple itself was supposed to be this place where people from all over the world could thank God, have a relationship with God, be forgiven by God, worship God, have access to Him. But because of the practices the religious establishment during Jesus' day had set up, that had become increasingly difficult, particularly for Gentiles, as we talked about last time. But also they were not a great lot of people in general, in some ways.
Yeah. So when Jesus curses the fig tree, for it not being fruitful, because it's Israel, the tree is Israel, and it's not bearing fruit.
The tree is the temple.
The tree is the temple,
in my understanding.
Okay.
Because what he does in the second here is he curses it. And the disciples also misunderstood what was going on. They didn't quite get what Jesus was doing, and they just asked him, "How did you do this thing? How did the tree wither so quickly?" And then Jesus responds with a really famous passage, but also a very cryptic passage, which is, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but you can also say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea and it will be done."
Right.
And most people, when I grew up reading that, I assumed this mountain was any old mountain.
Any obstacle that you want moved, you can, in faith, pray and it'll get out of your way.
But I think the better way to read this is Jesus is referring to the mountain the temple sits on.
The Temple Mount.
The Temple Mount.
Yep.
And he just said,
still there today.
This corrupt religious institution I've already said it's going to be torn down in 3 days.
Yep.
And I am asking you, my disciples, to join me by praying for its destruction. By praying for the end of this corrupted sacrificial system, this corrupted temple, and this hamstrung way in which my people are no longer allowing all the nations of the world to come and accept, to experience.
In the same
presence.
way that Jesus looked at the fig tree as a symbol of the temple and said, "May no fruit ever come from you again."
That's right.
He's saying, you too, my disciples, can do works like this.
Yes.
Meaning you'll be able to speak to this temple that's sitting right there on this mount in front of you.
Yes.
And say, "May no fruit come from you again."
Yeah.
And it will be done.
Yes.
Meaning, and it says that this mountain will be thrown into the sea.
Yeah.
Right? Which is really pictorial Jewish language, because the Temple Mount was a picture of the Garden of Eden. Yeah. It was the place that God created.
Yeah.
And to be thrown into the sea was to go back into uncreation.
Yeah,
all
chaos.
The chaos of the waters. He's like, we're going to take the Garden of Eden and throw it back into uncreation.
And often the sea would also refer to like other foreign nations and foreign powers.
Yep.
So to be thrown into the sea would be to be thrown against the powers of the
which
world.
is how it was destroyed in 70. In
70 AD. That's right. So what I think is kind of the fun way to imagine what Jesus is saying here is he's just done all these prophetic actions in the temple. He's critiqued the current temple leadership. He said he's building a new temple and a new sacrifice himself. And then as he's walking out, he turns to his disciples and says, "Okay, I'm going to curse this fig tree as a living picture of what I want you to do alongside me. If you have faith alongside me, if you pray that this temple will be thrown into the sea, you'll see the temple destroyed. You'll see these corrupt religious institutions finally brought down, and a true temple and a true sacrificial system finally brought about. Through your faith and through your prayers, you can join the rebellion against the religious and political status quo and join my kingdom."
That had to have seemed, and you can guess by some of the narratives that come after this, and even some of the questions that the disciples themselves ask. It would have seemed like such a strange thing to invite a faithful Jew into.
Oh, yeah.
Like, why on earth would it be good news for them to take the household of God and throw it to the chaos monsters of the other nations or uncreation? Or why would they want to see the temple destroyed? Why would this be a rebellion that they want to, join in on. Because I feel like now we hear this as like millennial disenfranchisement people. We're like, yeah, join the rebellion, overthrow the religious political system. Let's
burn
do
all
it.
churches, right?
Yeah, it's like for them, they'd be like, I don't want that to happen.
No, this is where I meet God. This is the only way I know how to receive forgiveness or to interact with God at all.
The covenant almost hinges on this place. Why are we throwing it into the sea?
That's right.
So, like, why did Jesus invite Jews who would have been skeptical of that into such a prayer to pray in faith that the temple would be destroyed? Why on earth would he be doing that, and why would that be good news to them?
Well, it's good news for those who belong to Jesus' new kingdom, because Jesus is building something better. Jesus is building a temple that's available to all people without qualification. He's building a sacrifice as one. He's offering himself as a single sacrifice for all people, no more need for continuous sacrifices. He is building a brand new religious order in himself that's orders of magnitude better than the one they've experienced before. And as we hinted at yesterday, this new temple and this new sacrificial system is going to be built on the fact that Jesus must die first and then rise from the dead. And a resurrected Jesus is going to sit at the head of this new kingdom and this new religious order, which means it will be incorruptible. The old temple system run by humans is always going to be subject to some sort of chaos, some sort of disorder, some sort of injustice, something.
Right.
But because it's now in the resurrected, perfect God sitting at his right hand, nothing will be able to assail the church, God's complete people of all people, ever again.
Yeah.
It's an incorruptible thing.
Yeah. I also wonder too if there's something about the fruitfulness of the tree, because if they really did grab onto the metaphor that Jesus was pulling on and bringing into visual reality, they would have known, like, man, this has kind of always been a problem. We've always had a barren tree, a barren vine when it came to the temple. Then Jesus, what he's offering them is, like you've said, a new temple, but what he's offering them is a vine that will actually bear fruit. Like a way for them to be human again, a way for them to be God's people again. Oh, like if this fake Garden of Eden gets thrown into the chaos waters of Genesis 1,
that's right.
I'm going to bring something new out of it, a new Garden of Eden, where I'm going to create a people who actually can be fruitful and multiply, where you're going to have a leaf, and fruit.
Yeah.
And your roots are going to go deep because they're going to be in me. And it's like, I wonder if they're picking up on this new humanity kind of idea that if we want to be fruitful, we can't be attached to this tree anymore. We need our roots to be in new soil, which is in Jesus.
I don't know if they got it until after Jesus rose from the dead.
Sure. Right.
But I think that does begin.
Well, they didn't know that he was going to be the new temple until he rose from the dead either.
Right. So they didn't know.
They weren't getting any of this.
They were just we're like
they were just like, weird. What a weird miracle.
But I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Because of the way the resurrection story ends with Jesus rising from the dead and sending out his disciples to go forth, increase and multiply, make disciples of all nations. Right.
Yep.
So like that is the way Holy Week ends,
Yeah.
is with a resurrected Jesus telling his disciples to go make disciples of all nations, not based on sex or procreation, but the proclamation that Jesus is risen from the dead and is king over all things.
A new commission to be fruitful and multiply.
That's right.
Yeah. That's cool. Okay. So why is the cursing of the fig tree good news for us today?
Yes.
Like, why should I be excited to celebrate Holy Tuesday today, other than the fact that maybe I understand this weird story a little better?
Yes. I mean, the good news is that, like the disciples, we are invited into a new era in which the old religious institution of perpetual sacrifices, incomplete atonement, is replaced by perfect atonement, perfect sacrifices, and incorruptible people of God that can no longer be overthrown by corrupt actors, but is headed by Jesus Christ himself.
Yeah.
This is what Jesus tells Peter. He's like, the gates of hell will never
overcome,
will never conquer the rebellion you are now leading. Like, what I'm creating after the temple will be orders of magnitude greater, unable to be conquered by a Roman force in AD 70, unable to be undone by malicious actors, abusive priests. No, I'm building something brand new that's not physically located, but spiritual, not of this earth.
Yeah.
And last forever.
I think another way to think about this too is we've been talking a lot about like, okay, with the old tree gone, let's talk about the new tree.
Yeah.
But also like there's good news in the fact that that old tree was cursed. Like that Jesus holds corrupt religious institutions responsible.
That's right.
Like that.
That's right.
That people who claim his name but don't do his works, right? Don't get off scot-free.
That's right.
That they're actually held responsible.
They're held responsible.
And that God will judge his church.
That's right.
His people. His people.
Yes.
And those, who are listening, who have been hurt by religious institutions that claim the name of Jesus.
Right.
They don't get a free pass. Like
they don't.
If they are a fruitless tree, they will be judged too. And like that can be really good news for people who have been wounded by those institutions.
That's right. We have biblical command to pray for the destruction of corrupt institutions as they exist today.
Right.
In hopes of being part of a new and better, more Jesus-honoring, Christ-exalting institution that is indestructible. It loves God and loves people well.
Yeah. Okay. So that's Jesus cursing the fig tree.
That's Jesus cursing the fig tree.
All right. What's tomorrow?
Well, after this whole incident with the cursing of the fig trees, the opposition between Jesus and the religious establishment continues to escalate, almost as if they are hearing what Jesus is saying about the fig tree and picking up on it. One of the parables Jesus says just after this is about a corrupt group of vineyard owners who are killing prophets, and they get that one, like, oh, you think we are the fruitless fig tree or the corrupt vineyard owners killing people. So they're recognizing that Jesus is saying all these things with the intention of ousting them from their power. And so they're going to continue to find ways to kill Jesus. And tomorrow we will figure out that they're going to recruit Judas to their side.
Yeah. So the betrayal or the recruitment of Judas and the anointing of Jesus by the woman with perfume.
That's right.
Tomorrow.
Yes.
Big day.
Big day.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us on this Holy Tuesday, and we will see you tomorrow for Holy Wednesday or Spy Wednesday, however you want to call it. We'll see you there. Well, welcome everyone to Holy Wednesday.
Yep.
This is the day that we remember two specific things that happened during Holy Week, right?
Yes, that's right.
One is Judas agreeing to betray Jesus, and two, Jesus being anointed by a jar of perfume in Bethany.
Yes. What's interesting about this day of Holy Week is that on actual Wednesday of Jesus' last life on earth, we don't really know what happened. If you read the gospel accounts, it seems that Jesus might have done some additional teaching in the temple. It seems as if potentially the chief priests and the religious elite are plotting actively for a way to bring Jesus down. But what we remember on this day is precisely what you just said. The anointing of Jesus by Mary with expensive perfume and the betrayal of Jesus. And I think the way that we're supposed to understand it in the narrative of Holy Week is that up until this, every day of Holy Week, Jesus has been making increasingly extravagant claims about who he is and what he's come to do. He's a rival king to Caesar.
Yeah.
He's a rival temple. He's a rival sacrifice. And he's calling on his disciples to join a rebellion and to burn the whole thing down.
Oh my gosh.
And so you, on Holy Wednesday, you kind of are forced with a choice. Whose opinion of Jesus are you going to land on?
Yeah.
And Mary and Judas give us two very different responses.
Very different.
To the message that Jesus has been proclaiming up until this point.
That's an interesting way to view it. Judas looks at this Jesus and he sides with the religious establishment.
That's right.
I've been following this guy for a while.
Yep.
But I've started to hear what he's saying and what he's claiming, and this is not the Messiah I've been waiting on.
That's right.
I think we should kill him.
Yeah.
And then Mary sees that this is exactly the kind of king she wants. She knows that he must die in order to bring about life and vindication and victory, and so she prepares him for burial.
That's right.
Okay.
And so
let's get into it.
So
I'm excited.
So the way the story works out, in the narrative of the book of John is this actually happens before Jesus rides in to Jerusalem on a donkey.
Yep.
And what happens is Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And as they're celebrating at a meal with the whole family, Mary breaks out this very expensive jar of perfume worth about a year's salary, 300 pieces of silver. She breaks it open, pours it on Jesus' head and feet, and rubs it into his skin. And it's kind of socially awkward.
Yeah.
Like, nobody was expecting this. This was not a common Jewish practice. This was not something that was done.
No, this was extravagant.
Super extravagant, kind of weird. Everybody, out of place. Yeah. Everybody would have felt uncomfortable with what's going on.
Right.
But John tells us that Mary does this to prepare Jesus for burial.
Right, because normally after a person is dead,
that's right,
you would wrap them in like linen cloths and you would embalm them with different ointments and spices and things like that,
that's right,
oils in order to make it smell better.
That's
right.
That's right.
During the funeral, during the visits, things don't smell as rancid as they would as the body decomposes. So you would cover that up with different perfumes and things. But Jesus is alive.
That's right.
When she's performing the embalming ritual.
That's right.
Which is very weird. And to do it at a dinner table is extra weird. So she is going out on a huge, I would say, faith limb.
I think
to do this.
Yeah. She's just watched her brother rise from the dead.
Yeah.
She has heard Jesus tell her that he is the resurrection and the life.
Yep.
And I think she finally understands that in order for Jesus to bring life to all people like he did for my brother, he has to die first.
That's right.
And so she's taking the most valuable thing she owns and anoints Jesus for the burial that she knows will save all God's people.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Which, so simultaneously, we're transferred, imagine, hard cut to the temple courtrooms. The Jewish Sanhedrin.
Because you're gonna what they're talking about.
Yes, at the very same moment this is happening, Caiaphas, the high priest, along with the leaders of,
they're all talking about Jesus.
They're all talking about Jesus, and they're all worried about what's going to happen and how Rome's going to come in and take away whatever sovereignty they have left.
Because there's this Jew who's claiming to be a king. They're going to come squelch this kind of rebellion, and we're going to lose what little power and freedom we have.
That's right.
And so they're like, we need to squelch this guy. We need to, and the only way to do that is to kill him.
Right.
And because if we don't, our nation is going to be completely overrun worse than it is by Roman powers.
That's right.
So they say, isn't it worth it for one guy to die to save a whole nation?
That's right. And so what's really interesting is that both Mary and Caiaphas have the same motivation to save the nation, to save God's people. And both of them want Jesus to die.
Right.
Isn't that really interesting?
That's very interesting.
So I think John is doing that intentionally.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So it's like everyone has to accept Jesus' death in one way or another.
Right.
But what does it mean?
What does it mean to you?
Is the important motivating
oomph
behind this story.
Yeah. Okay, so Mary's anointing Jesus for burial. Caiaphas and the high priests, they are scheming to kill him.
That's right.
And Judas is in the middle of it.
He
watches this extravagant sacrifice and he's offended by it.
Yeah. Along with all the other disciples, actually.
Yeah. And so he's like, we should have given this money to the poor. If we were going to spend $300 on perfume today.
A year's salary.
Yeah, a year's salary, $300. Instead of 300 pieces of silver.
David doesn't take a salary. It's the gospel.
And they're really offended by this. And obviously this cannot have been the straw that broke the camel's back. It couldn't have been the reason, I should say, that Judas decides to betray Jesus. But it was the straw that broke the camel's back.
It is the straw that breaks the camel's back.
And so he ends up going to who does Judas go to betray Jesus?
Judas speaks up and says, this is a waste. Yeah. This is overly extravagant. And then Jesus has this really famous line where he says,
oh, the poor you will always have with you.
Yeah. Judas hides behind his piety, saying, wouldn't it be better that we sold this very expensive thing and gave it all to the poor? But Jesus responds by saying, no, you'll always have the poor, but you won't always have me. And what he's implying there is not that we shouldn't care for the poor.
Right. I've heard people say that. that's like, oh, we shouldn't try to solve poverty. Jesus said, well, you always have the poor. So why should we try to solve it? It's pointless. That's not what's being said here.
Because Jesus is highlighting the value of what he has come to do.
Right.
He's come to save God's people.
Yeah. Another way to say what he's saying is it's like an idea of like good and better. Because it's like, oh, that would have been a good idea.
Yeah.
Here's a better one. I'm here right now.
Right.
You'll have that opportunity to care for the poor. But right now, she chose the best place to put that investment.
She is responding appropriately to what I've come to do and responding appropriately to me in this moment. Mm-hmm. And I am worth all that she has.
Right. And I've also heard someone say before that the real gift that the poor need in that moment is what she was preparing Jesus for.
That's right.
They need the provision, the rich provision of Jesus' death on their behalf.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And John also tells us that Judas was pocketing money. When, like, from the coffers of the disciples, their bank account, whatever. And so when he sees this, he's like, okay, I can't profit off Jesus anymore. And this is when he decides to go to the religious elite.
He's going to find another way to profit.
And then offers them his allegiance for a tenth of what Mary offers. 30 pieces of silver to her 300.
A tithe. Interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
I don't know what to do with that, but it's very interesting.
It is super interesting.
Okay. Yep. So he offers to betray Jesus. And that 30 pieces of silver thing, that's another prophetic fulfillment.
Yeah. There's mentions of that in the book of Zechariah,
which is the second this would be the second Zechariah fulfillment, because Jesus coming in on a donkey was one. And then the 30 pieces of silver is another reference in Zechariah.
That's right. I have a hard time following that thread in Zechariah because that last part of Zechariah gets really confusing.
It does.
But yes, he's also fulfilling what God promised hundreds of years before.
Something is happening there.
Yes.
Okay. So really what it sounds like to me is on the line here, and I think you said it really well at the beginning of this episode, is Jesus must die to save the nation of Israel.
And everybody recognizes it.
And everybody recognizes it and believes it.
Yeah.
But what it means to them is very, very different. Caiaphas and the religious order, they want Jesus to die in order to stop any threat of a Jewish uprising that would bring Rome down like a hammer.
That's right.
Judas wants Jesus to die because it's his only other way of profiting from
maintaining his standard of living.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which might be reductionistic, but anyway. And then Mary knows that Jesus needs to die because just like her brother, through death will come life. That will be the salvation of her people.
That's right.
Okay.
And so normally we've been ending these by saying, so why is Holy Tuesday, why is Holy Wednesday good news?
Yeah.
And so part of me wants to say, like, the challenge of Holy Wednesday is the story you've heard so far good news to you? Whose choice would you rather?
Oh, it's more of like a question.
It's more of a question. Do you see Jesus's death as worthy of all you have?
Right.
Would you be willing to waste
a year's salary
to prepare another man to die? Or will you find a way to kill him to preserve your own sense of
because on this side of the cross, it's like leading up to Jesus' death, everybody agreed that Jesus had to die, so much so that it was almost already a historical fact.
Yeah.
It was inevitable. It was going to happen.
Yeah.
And so whose side are you on?
Yeah.
Why is it happening? And now on this side of the cross, it is a historical fact. It has happened.
Yes.
Jesus has died. So what does it mean to you? Right.
That's right.
Is it just something, a fact of history that, it's the machinations of nations. And it was like, it was something that had to happen, or he probably said the wrong thing, or, people, it was a good guy who got crushed by a bad government, or, however you want to spin it. Or is it what Mary thought it was?
Yes.
Is it the salvation of all people?
That's right.
So it's interesting. Instead of asking the question, why is it good news?
It's like,
who is Jesus? What is Jesus' death to you?
Right.
Is the question that Holy Wednesday kind of presents.
Is everything that he's been saying up to this point, that he's the king of a new order, the beginning of a new religious establishment, is that offensive to you and want you to stop up your ears and not listen to it anymore?
Right.
Or is it causing you to pledge your fealty to Jesus, a man willing to die and who will eventually be resurrected? That's the choice Holy Wednesday offers us.
It's good. It's a good choice. Well, anything else?
That's it.
That's the choice.
That's the choice.
Make your choice.
Make your choice.
I love
it. And then we'll see you.
Okay, so then tomorrow is Maundy Thursday.
Maundy Thursday, that's right.
Yes, and Maundy means...
It means covenant. Or command.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's going to celebrate the new covenant.
That Jesus makes.
The Last Supper.
At the Last Supper, that's right.
So yeah, we'll have the institution of what a lot of people call communion or the Lord's table or the Eucharist.
Yep.
The Passover feast Jesus is going to do tomorrow.
That's right.
So that's exciting. Okay, well, we'll see you guys on Maundy Thursday. I always heard that and thought it was Monday, Thursday.
Monday, Thursday.
But it's Maundy Thursday.
Maundy, Thursday.
Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you tomorrow. Well, welcome everybody to Maundy Thursday.
That's right.
Is it Maundy or Monday? Monday. I don't know.
Choose your poison.
Pick your poison. But this is the day that we remember the Passover feast that Jesus held with his disciples, where he initiated a new covenant during Holy Week. Okay? So why should we be excited about Maundy Thursday?
This is probably the moment where Jesus starts to theologically interpret what he's about to do on the cross.
That's fascinating.
Jesus has been doing these very large public events where he's riding into Jerusalem on a donkey as a rival king and a rival to the religious establishment that's currently in power, very publicly arguing with the chief priests, Pharisees, and the Sadducees.
There seems to be like one person who gets it, Mary, when she anoints him, and it's
everybody wants to kill Jesus. And so Jesus is now taking a beat on the first day of Passover with his disciples, and he's saying, let me explain what's going to happen when I die.
And he does that through a very old meal.
The Passover feast.
The Passover feast.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get into this via the history here. Yeah. So Jesus is pulling on a Jewish feast that's been happening for a very long time.
Yep, that's right.
And it goes all the way back to Exodus, when the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt. And, God had been sending all the plagues until finally there was one final plague that would finally convince Pharaoh to let the people go and establish the new nation under God.
Freedom from slavery. Yeah.
And
that's important. Freedom from slavery and establish a new nation.
That's right.
Because we're talking about kingship. So like the Passover feast is connected to the idea of Israel establishing itself as a people and a kingdom for the very first time in history.
Because after Passover, they leave Egypt, they go to Mount Sinai, and God establishes his covenant with them and says, you will be my people, I will be your God.
That's right.
And so it's Passover and the establishing of God's people and God's covenant is, they're very similar.
Yes, that's right.
They're connected. And so that last plague that came against Egypt was the death of the firstborn.
That's right. And before that, God promised that there would be a way to escape the death of the firstborn.
Right.
People of Israel would need to sacrifice a lamb, take its blood and paint it on the doorposts of their home, and eat it at a meal with flat bread, which was matzah bread, or not matzah bread, but unleavened bread, flat bread, and then wine as well.
And bitter herbs.
This is the meal that would reenact their salvation story, but also act as the meal that they would eat that would save them from coming death and establish them as God's people.
Okay, hold on. Let me say that again. This is the meal. The Passover meal is the meal that would save them from coming death and establish them as God's covenant people.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yes.
That's helpful.
Yes.
Okay.
And free them from slavery, but
all that too. That's also very good.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Yes. Okay, very good. And so for years after that, obviously there were times within Israel's history that the Passover stopped being celebrated due to lapses in law obedience. Yeah. But for all intents and purposes, we could say, for years and years and years, the people of Israel have been taking this feast. And why were they taking it? Why were the people of Israel still participating in the Passover meal every year? What did it mean to them?
Well, I mean, to keep it kind of really unspiritual for a second, it's Passover. There's all these messianic expectations for Jesus. They're still living under slavery to Rome.
Right.
This meal would have been eaten in hope that through the blood of a lamb, through the enjoyment of bread and wine, that they could still, by God's power, be rescued from death, freed from slavery, and be established as a new people once again.
That's helpful to think about Israel under Roman oppression,
right?
Kind of enslaved again under this world power, and to eat that meal under Roman oppression is almost an act of rebellion.
Yes.
They're expecting some kind of overthrow. I could even imagine some people praying that night as they were eating, like, God, would you bring the death of the firstborn of Caesar?
Yeah.
Like, would you come and just do what you did in Egypt? It was an expectation meal that God would free them from their oppressors and reestablish them as the covenant people of God that they were meant to be. Yeah. And so people are gathering around, the disciples are gathering around Jesus. They've taken this meal before. This isn't their first Passover.
Right.
They know what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, what it's going to taste like, what their expectations are going to be. And Jesus sits them down and subverts the whole thing.
Yeah, he takes one of the glasses of wine and some of the bread and then redirects the meaning of those elements away from remembering a past act of salvation and reinterprets them as symbols of what he has come to do. That's the innovation that Jesus makes.
What's going to happen tomorrow?
That's right. What's going to happen tomorrow? And he says, "This is my body, broken. Do this in remembrance of me, not of the Exodus.
Right.
Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup. This is a new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you, which is my blood poured out for you, not a lamb's blood.
Yeah.
My blood poured out for you.
Okay, so the lamb, Jesus is saying that he's the new lamb. We had this Passover lamb, but its blood wasn't poured into a cup that was drank.
Oh, right.
Right? Its blood was spread over the doorpost.
Yeah.
But now Jesus is saying that he's the new lamb whose blood will save you. And instead of painting it over the doorway of your house, you're going to paint over the doorway of your body, in a sense.
Or instead of drinking the wine and remembering the blood in the house, because like the same color, you'll drink this wine and remember the blood that I'm about to spill for your protection and for your salvation.
So not only is Jesus redirecting the focus of something past to what he's about to do, he's also kind of reinterpreting some of the symbols.
That's right.
And so the bread too, I don't think when people were eating the unleavened bread, they were thinking about someone's body.
No.
So Jesus is using that moment to provide new meaning to that element in the supper.
Yes.
And saying that it is his body. Because the idea of the unleavened bread for the original audience was the idea that they didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise.
Yeah,
because they had to eat it like standing up with their belt on and ready to get out of Egypt. So don't even wait for the bread to rise. Don't use leaven. Just cook flat bread, eat it, and go.
And in the expectation that rescue and salvation
right around the corner.
Was right around the corner.
Which is why the next day Jesus is going to die. So in him saying like my body's going to be broken like this unleavened bread, eating the unleavened bread means that God's salvation is hastening. It's close, which is why Good Friday is tomorrow.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
It's just around the corner. Okay. That's pretty cool.
One way that I thought about it earlier was God's covenant on the first Passover promised freedom and a new kingdom on the other side of a sacrificed lamb and a dead firstborn.
Right.
And at the same meal, Jesus makes a new covenant and promises that by the sacrificed body and blood of God's firstborn, God's people will be freed finally and forever.
Yeah.
That's the new, deeper level of it. Like, I won't require the firstborn of the evil powers anymore.
Right.
I'm the most powerful empire in the world, and I will sacrifice my firstborn so that all people can be included in my kingdom.
Wow. That's amazing. Just thinking about the hypothetical situation that I mentioned earlier in which, some Jewish person was sitting there being like, God, would you just bring a plague and kill the firstborn of Caesar,
Right.
Do what you did in the Exodus. He's like, I'm going to do something better. I'm going to let my own son die to save you. Man, that's a lot of grace.
A lot of grace.
Talk to me then about this idea of a new covenant, because there's a few things we need to explore there to really understand what's going on. One is, what's a covenant? 2, what was the old covenant? And 3, what does it mean that there's a new covenant? So what's a covenant?
A covenant is just an agreement that God makes with humans.
Yeah.
Normally, the leaders of a nation or of a particular people. But it's agreement between God and people.
Okay. And so when God rescued Israel out of Egypt that first time, celebrated by the first Passover, and he said, I will be your God, you will be my people, I will establish my covenant with you. What was he establishing with them there? What was that covenant?
Well, what's interesting here is I had never thought about this until studying this passage, but it seems like there is multiple covenants going on. If you take covenant simply to mean agreement between God and people, God makes an agreement with Israel before they ever get to Mount Sinai. He tells them, eat the lamb, paint the doors, I will save you.
Right.
And then 50 days later, after their journey in the wilderness, after the Red Sea, they get to Mount Sinai, and then he makes an official covenant that we all know is a covenant because he uses the word covenant, in which he establishes them as people. So as I was thinking through this, there's multiple agreements God's making with his people, in which he's saving them in different ways. There's a covenant that saves them from slavery, sets them free from Pharaoh, and there's another covenant, in a sense, in which he makes them his people for the first time. And normally in a covenant, what happens is God says, I have expectations of you, and here's what I'll offer in return. I expect you to eat the lamb, and in return, I will save you. I expect you to obey my laws, to love God and love others. And in return, you will be my people. That's a covenant. So that's what a covenant is. That's the old covenants that God made with his people.
And the covenant was that God has saved them, right? And is making them his people. That he would dwell with them, be their God, keep them safe, and give them a law to obey. Like, here's how to be my people in the world.
Maybe even more granularly, the covenant is, if you eat the lamb, if you drink the blood, if you eat the lamb, if you break the body, if you remember the cup, I will save you from death of the firstborn. I will save you from Egypt.
Right.
So if we take it granularly right there, that's the covenant. And so the new covenant that God is making with his people right there is, if you drink this bread, or drink this
That's
wine.
That's called beer.
If you drink this wine and eat this bread, this constitutes a new Passover meal in which I will save you from certain death by the death of my own firstborn. And I will save you from slavery to Pharaoh, and I will bring you to a place where I'm establishing a new kingdom. Because
it's the agreement of what Jesus is going to accomplish on the cross.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
That's cool. What I also like is, when they do come out of Egypt into Mount Sinai, and the word covenant is
finally used,
right? You have this agreement in the covenant. The summation of the covenant is love God, love others. Right? And when Jesus says he's establishing a new covenant there on Passover, he's like, you've heard this old thing, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. But I'm giving you a new command. So here's your end of the bargain, right? Your side of the covenant is to love your neighbor as I have loved you. And it's like, still love your neighbor, but in a different way. Instead of love your neighbor as yourself, it's love your neighbor as I have loved you. And it's this like new way of being human.
Yeah, that is part of what Maundy Thursday generally communicates, is the escalation of the command to love others.
Oh, cool.
Because in some of the gospel accounts, that's exactly what Jesus says at this meal. Is like, now you must love others as I have loved you,
which is sacrificially all the way to death.
That's right. That's right.
Like it's represented in the blood and in the bread.
Yes.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing. Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, what's crazy is that's only a sliver of what happens on Maundy Thursday. That's the new covenant, the new command, the new promise to save, the new ethic to live by, the new ethic of a new kingdom. Like, all that's happening here at Passover dinner. And then Judas leaves to betray Jesus with a kiss. The disciples start arguing about who's the best leader and who's the least likely to betray Jesus. Jesus goes to a nearby garden and starts praying and actually asks God to spare him from giving up the cup that he's just offered his disciples.
Right, from having to actually go to the cross and spill his blood in the way that he just offered.
Yeah, and then Judas returns with a mob to drag Jesus to a Jewish court. The disciples then scatter. One of the disciples is left naked at one point. He's placed in front of the Jewish court. They accuse him of blasphemy, and then he's beaten until sunrise. And that's how Maundy Thursday ends, with finally all the pieces that we've been talking about finally in place.
Yeah. It is amazing for Jesus to be like, here's my body, here's my blood. And they're probably scratching their heads being like, I don't see what you're talking about. This is just our Passover meal.
That's right.
And then just hours later, Jesus is under arrest.
That's right.
Being beaten.
That's right.
On the way to execution.
That's right.
And they're like, oh, he really meant his blood and his body. It got very real. Why is it good news that we have Jesus facilitating a new covenant of his body and his blood on the cross? Why is that better news than why don't we celebrate? Why is it better that we celebrate using the bread and the cup to remember the cross instead of the Passover of Exodus? Like, why has what Jesus has done eclipsed what God did in Egypt?
I think there's one way to answer this question, and that's the way you're framing it, and it's, how is it better?
Yeah.
And this kingdom is the final kingdom. He's about to go in front of Pilate and explain how his kingdom is not of this world, and how the order that he's establishing can never be destroyed. And it's going to be proven when he rises from the dead, because his kingdom is a resurrection kingdom, unable to be overthrown by any empire like Pharaoh or like Rome that wields the power of death. Like, it is an indestructible kingdom that cannot be assailed. It's better by orders of magnitude. Right?
Yeah.
The salvation Jesus also offers is better than the salvation that was offered to, like, Jews were saved from actual slavery.
Good
thing.
That's good. That's a good thing.
Amazing thing. They were constituted as a people of God. Like, great thing. Now we're not just freed from nations, and oftentimes we're not.
Oftentimes we're not. Yeah.
But we're freed from the more primordial powers, the powers that fuel nations and fuel sin, evil, Satan, the powers that rule this world in some sense. Like, we are freed from their curse and never need to be beholden to them again, because the worst thing they can do is kill us.
Right. And we're free from that too.
And then the nation that was formed after Passover was the Jewish nation.
Right.
A great nation.
Yes, right.
Now that God's people are both Jews and non-Jews.
Right.
It's all people.
The house of prayer for all nations.
The house of prayer for all nations, like we talked about before. It's like, it is better.
Yeah.
The thing that Jesus is inaugurating is better.
Yeah.
And the God that is doing it is continuing to prove himself as the kind of God that has existed for his people in all ages past.
Oh, you're saying that, like, Jesus is showing in repeating this Passover meal that he has been consistently faithful.
Right.
I saved you back then. I'll save you now. I'll save you in the future.
And I am increasing the stakes, because I'm not going to require your lambs anymore.
Right. So maybe that's another reason why this one is better, is because in the first Passover, it required the death of the evil in order to bring salvation. But in this one, Jesus, the death of the righteous, achieves salvation. That there's this self-sacrificial upping of the ante that God makes in giving his own son instead of killing Caesar.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's insane. Okay.
Yeah.
That's Maundy Thursday.
And that's Maundy Thursday.
That's
right.
the new covenant. That's the Passover meal.
This is the part of Holy Week where I feel like I start running out of words to communicate the impact of these things that are happening.
Because it's just everything.
Because this is now everything.
Yeah.
This is,
yeah, it's not like, oh, cool, okay, the judging of the fig tree. Awesome. It's like, no, this is like the center of the universe.
Right.
It's like, okay, amazing. Well, thank you guys for joining us here on Maundy Thursday. We're excited to get into Good Friday tomorrow, which is the day of Jesus' death.
That's right.
And we'll talk about why such a horrible day could be good.
Yeah.
So we'll see you tomorrow. Well, welcome everybody to Good Friday, This is our walk through Holy Week. Yesterday we were in Maundy Thursday, the day that Jesus reoriented the Passover meal toward his death, his own body and blood. And today we are talking about the day Jesus was crucified.
Yeah. One
of the most important days in the history of the universe.
Yeah. I said this at the end of yesterday, but this is the day that feels like so much happened, so much is contained within the crucifixion of Jesus that especially a 15-minute podcast feels like, oh man,
how are we
will say less than the day deserves.
Yes, we will. So we'll state that at the beginning that we are here to just kind of provide some meditation and some clarity and some teaching, but we'll not be able to communicate the gravitas of everything that happened on this day. So we kind of left off yesterday, Maundy Thursday, with Jesus being betrayed by Judas, taken away, beaten until the sun rises. And now he's in the hands of who?
The day ends with Jesus being accused of blasphemy by the Jewish court system. But the Jewish court system has no right to execute anybody.
Right, because they're under Roman power, and only Rome can approve execution, capital punishment.
Right, but Rome has different standards for the death penalty than Jews might. Blasphemy would not be on their radar.
I don't really care.
So the religious establishment has to make up charges against Jesus.
Right. They call him a tax evader, right?
They call him a tax evader and an insurrectionist claiming to be the king of the Jews.
Which, if you're going to try to get Rome to kill somebody, those are the two to go for.
Tax evasion.
Tax evasion, because Rome loved their taxes.
Yes.
And two, insurrectionist, someone threatening the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome.
Yeah.
Those two things will get you killed.
Yeah.
In Rome.
That's right.
That's right.
That's exactly
so they bring those charges against him, but they're having trouble with it sticking.
Right. Jesus, never said it.
Right.
But he also never denies it.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Especially the king of the Jews thing.
The king of the Jews things.
Right, yeah.
But what they do, so Pilate says, okay, I'll see your case. The Roman governor at the time.
Roman governor at the time, Pontius Pilate, sees the case, hears the evidence, and comes to the conclusion, especially when you read Luke's narrative.
That's right.
That Jesus is innocent par excellence. He can find nothing to bring against Jesus.
Right. He's claiming that his kingdom is not of this world, which means that
he's not trying to usurp Roman power, earthly power.
He's doing nothing wrong.
Right.
And so Pilate correctly perceives that the Pharisees are trying to use his execution system to benefit their agenda.
Yes, but then he also knows that there's a delicate piece in the balance here. He has to play politics.
Right.
And so if he just says, you know what, everybody get over it, I'm releasing Jesus, he'd have a mutiny on his hands.
Right.
And so he tries to play politician, and he gives them what he thinks will be an olive branch. He says, okay, on Passover, we have a tradition where I release one of your Jewish prisoners.
That's right.
Right? And so he says, should I release to you this known insurrectionist named Barabbas, who was actually guilty of killing and marauding and
he was a terrorist.
He was a terrorist, but he was trying to do the same thing Jesus was, but in a different way. He was trying to bring about the downfall of this evil kingdom, but through violence and wickedness. And surely they won't take this marauder over this Jesus. So who should I release from prison, Barabbas or Jesus?
And they choose Barabbas.
Yeah, they choose we always choose Barabbas, don't we?
And we
always choose
a little bit of force,
a little bit
of
peace.
self-sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly.
A couple interesting things that about this is one that I think Pilate is doing this to expose their motives.
Oh, that's cool.
Because he knows that they're trying to use him.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, well, then I'm just going to out you for what you really are.
Right.
This isn't about actual justice for insurrectionists. Otherwise, you'd actually keep the insurrectionists prisoned.
That's
right.
This
is really about your.
He's like, here's a person who has the same claims that you're charging Jesus against. What do you want to do? I'm going to force you to be a hypocrite.
That's right.
That's clever.
He's very clever.
Yeah.
And then on a kind of theological divine coincidence note, do you know what the name Barabbas means?
No.
Son of the Father.
Oh, man.
So,
So you have the Son of God and the Son of God?
Yeah, Son of the Father and the Son of the Father, and they choose the wrong one.
They choose the wrong Son of God?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Isn't that fascinating?
That is fascinating.
So,
yeah.
Yes.
And what else is interesting, too, is when Pilate backs him into a corner, you know, the people, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, they end up saying something that's so self-condemning.
What do they say?
He says, "Isn't this your king?" And they say, "We have no king but Caesar."
That's right.
They throw all of their political allegiance, at least publicly, behind Rome, and completely abandon the messianic quest in that moment.
That's right.
Which is just heartbreaking to read in the biblical narrative of a search for a king,
Yeah.
to finally have the king that they've been waiting for standing before them, and then to look at him and say, you know what, never mind, we have no king but Caesar, crucify Jesus.
Yeah. And they get a mob to help them in this. They rile up a crowd, start a riot, get this whole crowd to chant, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him.
And let's talk about crucifixion for a second.
Okay.
Because like, if you're reading the narrative and you didn't know where this was going, I feel like the crowd chanting crucify him, if you were a reader in this time, you would have been like, how did we get there so quickly? How did we get to the most inhuman form of execution that Rome has to offer? Like, it was that kind of execution was reserved for criminals that needed to be made an example of.
Yeah, like
that wasn't the standard way they killed people.
No, it was like
that was the extraordinary case.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm just trying to like inhabit the mind of a first century person.
The best, like the visceral reaction
Yeah.
that I have to the word lynching.
Lynching, yeah.
Is probably the closest visceral reaction we can get to crucifixion.
Right.
It's this public spectacle.
Yes.
It's a form of execution that's a spectacle.
Yeah.
And makes an example of, but shames the person being killed, while also being done to some extent for the entertainment of others watching.
That's right. To get just a little graphic.
Yeah.
And Jesus was spared this because of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
His body was taken off the cross.
That's right.
After he died. But typically, what would happen was these bodies would be left up on the crosses as these prolonged symbols of what happens when you cross Rome.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, the road to the Pax Romana was paved by 1,000 crosses. You know, like the only way they kept the peace was by under threat of violence.
By wielding death.
And so much so that these people that would hang up on the cross, often their bottom halves would be eaten by wild dogs.
Crazy.
And it was just like this horrible, disgraceful, shameful way to die.
Yeah.
And so for the Pharisees to wield and request the worst weapon of Rome is just one of the craziest scandals I've ever seen. And because I think for us, cross just kind of goes right over our heads. But like, I just wanted to land for a moment on what Jesus was being confronted with.
Yeah, it's very heavy.
Yeah.
It's very heavy. But perhaps more surprising than the Pharisees' willingness to execute one of their own is the way that Jesus' death is also subverts everything about the crucifixion. When he is carted off to be crucified, the Roman soldiers start torturing him. They put a crown on his head of thorns, right? They put a purple robe on him. They put a scepter in his hand made out of reeds, and they all bowed to him. He said he was the king of the Jews, and so they're mocking him for this claim. Yeah. But then the gospel writers will also say that when Jesus is finally hammered into the cross, he's lifted up or raised up, which is the same type of language that kings would have been described by when they are raised up to their throne.
Right.
So if you've been paying attention to the narrative so far, Jesus has said all the way back when Mary anointed his feet that he must die in order to be the king that brings life.
Right, and he rode in on the king's animal, and his journey to his throne has been there ever since.
Right.
And so he got his crown, he got his robe, and now his throne is a cross.
Yeah, and he transforms this public image, this public shaming device into a place of enthronement
to show that he's going to bring life from death.
That's right.
And then nailed like above his cross is a sign, Jesus, King of the Jews.
Yes.
Right?
That's
like,
right.
There's even an inscribed title on his throne.
Yes. And it makes the religious elite uncomfortable because
they say take it down.
They said no. He said they said it should say he said he is the King of the Jews.
We don't think he said that. Yeah.
He's like, I've written what I've written.
I've written what I've written. Oh, it's too good.
It's really good.
He was a clever little guy.
He's like, for as politically expediency and cowardice, he was clever.
Yeah. We're not like on Team Pilot here.
We're not on Team Pilot.
Okay,
so,
interesting. Yes.
When he's on the cross.
Yes.
He does some things that are very memorable.
Yeah.
The one that most of us think of is that he forgives his tormentors.
Yeah. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Right. And then in another story, he is hanging on his cross next to two other people also tried for insurrection. Mm-hmm. And one of them's mocking Jesus, and the other one is sympathetic to Jesus. Yep. And Jesus turns to him and says, "Don't worry, today you will be with me in paradise. Yeah. You'll be with me in my new kingdom." And then after this moment is the moment when Jesus dies.
Yeah, he says, "It is finished."
It is finished.
Yeah.
It is finished. And then he dies.
Yeah.
And then the curtain in the temple,
right, where he was just a few days earlier,
where this whole thing started, splits in two.
Right.
And
that curtain is the place in between the priests of God, the people of God, and God's presence, the mercy seat.
Yes. Right? So once a year, behind that curtain, there's a special box called the mercy seat.
Yep. And this is in the Holy of Holies.
Holy of Holies. Yep. Yeah. The most sacred place within the temple. And once a year, the high priest, Caiaphas, would have gone in there and taken blood and sprinkled it on there. And that would have given mercy to all of God's people. So it is packed with a lot of very interesting irony, but deep symbolic significance that Jesus' final moments is spent forgiving his tormentors, those responsible for his execution, a fellow insurrectionist, and then the mercy seat in which Caiaphas has asked God to atone for his people's sins is now potentially atoning for Caiaphas's if he would accept Jesus' death.
Oh my gosh.
He doesn't. But that's what Jesus is doing in that moment.
Yeah.
He's saying, because I have died, I'm the blood that's sprinkled on the mercy seat by the high priest.
Right.
And anyone who desires God's mercy can have it. That's
the death of Jesus is good news. Friday is good because that death provides forgiveness for those who killed him.
He, the way Isaiah says it, he was pierced for our transgressions.
Oh, right.
He was crushed for our iniquities. And think about that language. Our iniquities. Whose iniquities? Israel's iniquities. Yeah. And he's a prophet. He's the religious establishment, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, these people are part of the court system. Our iniquities, the punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds, we, God's people, are healed.
So, Isaiah is predicting this suffering servant, this anointed Messiah who would be punished for the things that we should be punished for.
Yes.
But it's not, what's interesting is it's not that, he got the punishment instead of us only. It's, but by his wounds we're healed. It's not, he got wounded and I didn't.
Right.
It's, I have festering wounds already.
But I get to be in paradise?
But I get to be healed and be in paradise. It's like, it's not only do I escape death, but I get a kind of life that I would have never
expected.
You get
resurrection life. Right. That you get that.
It's like I've heard one person say, like, I think we think about, like, if this is equilibrium, and for our audio only listeners, I'm holding my hand up kind of middle of my body. And we start right next to zero, you know, and as we sin, we dip down -1, -2, -3. We keep dropping down and down and down. And we think that Jesus' death brings us back to zero, back to equilibrium.
Right.
And in fact, what that would be, by his wounds, we're not wounded.
Yeah, by his wounds.
But he says, but by his wounds, we're healed. So sure, we're at -1,000, but when Jesus dies for us, we're not brought to zero.
Right.
We're brought to a healing we would have never received beforehand. Like without him, we are brought to this new kind of life that we would have never deserved.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what's amazing too, to come back to your point, is who is Jesus saving in this moment? Who is he surrounded by? Who is he offering this mercy to?
Yes.
It's not his tried and true, buddies who deserved it.
Right.
No one is around him who deserves this.
Yeah, he's abandoned by all of his followers. Like, he's alone, except maybe for his mother.
Yeah, and John. Yeah.
He's alone. And so he is offering this forgiveness, this mercy, to everyone who's abandoned him and everyone who's made his death possible.
Right. And it's like, that has to open up something in your heart. Like,
yes.
To be like, because I am an expert at disqualifying myself from God's grace.
Yeah.
I'm like, I think everybody else deserves it except me. And, but what it says is, it does not matter what you've done.
Right.
It literally doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how you could be responsible for killing God himself, and he would forgive you. And that's what's amazing, that he chose like someone like Paul,
right,
who did murder Christians.
Yeah, and when Jesus met him, he said, "Why are you hurting me?"
Right. Yeah. And it's a person like that Jesus not only forgives but elevates and uses.
Yeah.
So it's amazing, the circumstance of the crucifixion. It shows you who is qualified to receive the grace that was earned on the cross.
Right.
And it's the very people who killed him.
And go back to, why was Jesus so angry when he cleared out the temple? He was angry on one level because they were excluding Gentiles, people who would have, by virtue of their ethnicity, the Jewish establishment was kicking them out. But God's intention has been that all people, regardless of sin status, regardless of guilt status, could be accepted into his temple.
Right.
And so any boundary on top of that is angering. Yeah. Why would you put more barriers between me and my people when I don't even count guilt?
Right.
Their guilt in killing me against them.
Yeah. No wonder he was so mad.
No wonder he was so mad.
He was so mad because he's like, you are excluding people I'm trying to show grace to.
Yes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So it is finished.
It is finished.
Jesus dies. It opens up a path to all who will come to receive mercy from the mercy seat because of Jesus' sprinkled blood. And the Sabbath day is approaching.
That's right.
And
the day that Jesus lays in his tomb.
So they asked to take him off the cross so he can rest on the Sabbath. He's taken down off the cross and put in a borrowed tomb of a man named Joseph of Arimathea, right?
Yep,
Is that right?
That's right.
Is that right? That's right.
That's
okay.
right.
That was Simon Cyrene. That's the guy who carried the cross. I was like, did I switch them in my head? No. Okay. So he's put in a borrowed tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and he's laid to rest, and everybody goes home for the Sabbath.
That's right. Morning. That's Good Friday.
That's Good Friday. Again, I do feel the weight of what you said at the beginning.
Right.
I can't give word to
there's a lot of
what's happening here.
There's a lot of different thoughts on why it's called Good Friday. Like, it's not a clear answer to why traditionally it's been called Good Friday. Some people say it's good because of what Jesus accomplished.
Yeah.
He gives mercy to people who don't deserve it,
right,
which is a good enough reason to call it Good Friday.
It's good.
Other people, and I think this is interesting, it's a corruption of God's Friday.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. But it was like, this is when God does all the work. Like, this is the Friday in which God's new covenant with humanity, his mercy towards humanity, it's all being done.
Wow.
This is God's Friday.
God's Friday.
This is God's last act of work.
I love that.
I like that too.
Oh, because so after the resurrection, spoiler alert, Jesus on the road to Emmaus.
Yep.
He says, I want you to look at all the law and all the prophets, everything in your Old Testament.
Yeah.
And in all of it, you can see why the Son of Man, why the Messiah had to die and raise 3 days later. He's saying, like, all of Scripture has been pointing to a time that the Messiah would die.
Right.
And God's been telling that story all the way to his day when he would make everything he promised and foreshadowed come true.
Yeah.
And that's why it's God's Friday, is because on the cross, Jesus finished everything God said would be done. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay. That is Good Friday.
Yeah.
Tomorrow is Black Saturday or Holy Saturday.
That's right.
The day where nothing happens.
Where nothing happens.
Because Jesus is resting in the tomb on the day of rest.
Yeah.
The day of Sabbath. So thank you for joining us today on Good Friday. We will see you again tomorrow on Holy Saturday. Well, welcome everybody to Holy Saturday, or as some call it, Black Saturday.
That's right.
Yeah. This is the day that we remember when Jesus laid in the tomb.
That's right.
It's the day of Sabbath rest. So most of the rest of the Jewish world in this time wasn't doing much. They were resting.
Yeah.
And Jesus was resting.
That's right.
He was in the tomb. So this is a day that in me, like in my growing up as a Christian, I was never invited to think about. I was never told to be like, I never heard a lesson on the day Jesus laid in the tomb.
Yeah.
You just kind of hop over this day. You
right, because nothing happens.
To resurrection. And like even like my own church, like we have Good Friday service and we have Easter Sunday.
That's right.
We don't celebrate Saturday, you know?
Yeah.
And so what's going on here? Why should we care about Holy Saturday?
Yeah.
Why should we focus on it?
Well, the lack of teaching on it makes a little bit of sense because we're not really told much happens on this day.
Right.
Within Scripture, what happens is the religious leaders get anxious because they heard that Jesus prophesied he would rise on the third day.
Right.
So they're convinced the disciples might try to steal the body.
Yeah.
So they go back to Pilate, the governor of Jerusalem at that time, and convince him to put some guards up to prevent any shenanigans and making all their problems worse.
Okay.
That's the only information we have.
So only Rome is doing something.
Only Rome is doing something.
Yeah.
Like
Everybody
that.
else is Sabbathing.
And so really then like, okay, we don't have a lot of textual stuff to go on, but like as a day in the Christian calendar, as a moment and an event in Jesus' life, what should we be thinking about?
Yeah.
On a day where Jesus does nothing.
Right.
And I think the fact that Jesus has done nothing, or is doing nothing, or did do nothing on this day.
On this day, because he was dead?
Because he was dead, is actually part of what we're supposed to meditate on.
Yeah, it's the message. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, before we jump into that, let's frame some categories.
Okay.
Because we have a day, Saturday, the Sabbath day.
Yeah. All faithful Jews were not working.
Right. Let's talk about the Sabbath for a second and what its origins and significance were and are.
They have their origins in, the Ten Commandments.
And first in the creation story.
The creation story before that. That's right. Yeah.
So, God worked for 6 days.
That's right.
And on the seventh day, he rested.
That's right.
And he looked at everything he made and said, it is good. And so he patterned his people after that for 6 days they could work, and on the seventh day they would rest. And in so doing, they would recognize that God is the sovereign provider of everything in their life, not their own toil.
Yeah. And throughout the biblical story, sevens and groups of sevens, or a 6 plus 1, is often a way to talk about a new thing beginning, or the start of something, or the end of one thing. Like even when King Solomon was coronated and his father said that his son would rule in his place, he gives him 7 commands. Because he's beginning something new.
Yes.
He's starting a new phase of the king, of the dynasty.
The time of David's work was over, and now it's time for Solomon.
So the 6 and 7 pattern is
cool.
throughout Scripture as the ending of one thing and the dawning of a new.
Yeah.
It's similarly in the Mount Sinai, and it's in reference to the Passover, because they used to work 7 days when they were in slavery.
When they were slaves, they worked every day of the week. That's right.
But now that they are in God's new kingdom, they will rest because, as you said before, God is doing the work.
That's right. On the seventh day, we rest because God's working.
That's right.
Okay. But now on the seventh day, on Holy Saturday, Jesus, as God in the flesh, is resting.
Yeah, and I think it's because he's done everything he's supposed to do.
He said it is finished.
Yeah, all the miracles are done.
Yep.
There's no more sins to atone for, no more religious elite to question and humiliate.
No more fig trees to curse.
No more fig trees to curse, no more powers to fight. He has done everything that he needs to do to bring the dawning of a new creation.
Right.
And so like a good faithful Jew,
he rests.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, from the people's perspective, they're resting too.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't like, Jesus died and then they had to do something to bring him back to life.
That's right.
They didn't earn what's going to come on Easter Sunday. They didn't earn resurrection. they were resting too, and probably resting in mourning, for some, and relief for others.
Yeah. The invitation, I think what you're getting at here is, in a day where Jesus says it is finished and all the work has been done in the past, and even God himself decides it's a day of rest.
Yeah.
It's an invitation for us to realize that everything we need to be entered into God's kingdom and gain access to God has already been provided, and is being provided to such an extent by God that not even God himself feels the need to work. So you do not need to work to be part of God's kingdom,
right?
To become part of his family, to have access to God, to be forgiven by him.
Yeah.
It's all been done for you.
Yeah.
Rest.
You can have a Holy Saturday because Jesus had a Good Friday.
Yes.
Like, you can rest because Jesus worked.
Yeah.
And Jesus invites you into his rest by waiting today, by resting today. Yeah. I think about the author of Hebrews. He talks about how there's this Sabbath rest that still remains for the people of God, that is being extended to God's people. But for him, he's not saying, hey, take the seventh day off. I don't think he's denying that one should do that, but he's using that metaphorically, and he's extending to them the idea of faith in Jesus,
right,
is Sabbath rest.
Yeah.
And that Sabbath rest remains if you put your faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
It's just interesting. He's like, and you can rest from your work.
Right.
Because, we toil like crazy to validate ourselves, right? To our own psyche, to our neighbors, to our culture, to our work environments, to our families. For a lot of us, we think we're trying to validate ourselves to God.
Yeah.
Like, have I impressed you yet, God? Like, do you think I've done enough yet, God? Like, I know here at Spoken Gospel, we get questions all the time. How do I know I'm saved?
Yeah.
Right? How do I really know that I know that I know that I'm saved? And a lot of times it's, have I done enough? Have I believed hard enough? And what we all need, the message we all need is there's rest. Like, we need a message of rest.
Jesus
that the work is done.
All.
Yeah.
It is finished.
It is finished.
You can rest.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the ritual of baptism is a symbol of this day.
That's right.
We all die in the water. We all rest in the water.
We're buried
in the water, and then risen to new life. And that is a passive action.
Right. So you are being baptized.
You are being baptized. You are being buried. You are doing nothing, resting like Jesus, because soon, the next day, you'll be resurrected in his power by his grace.
Yeah.
So the invitation on Black Saturday is to rest like God did, because he has done everything needed to bring you to him and to bring him to his kingdom. Yeah.
So for people today, kind of in between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, I'm sure a lot of people are preparing for family, and
right.
They've got busy calendars and everything. But if they're watching this, if they're listening to this, what are ways we're talking about? Like, it is finished. Rest. Take a Sabbath. When we're talking about this, what are we inviting them into? What is Jesus inviting them into? What does it mean to rest in the work that is finished? Does it mean like, just don't worry about it, just live however you want, don't go to church tomorrow, treat people however you want? Like, what is the rest that he's actually inviting them into that we're talking about here? Maybe it's simply,
Maybe a better word than rest is just confidence. There's like all this anxiety. What is our relationship to other people? What is our relationship to God? What is our relationship to ourselves? What must I do to feel right with myself, the world, and God? And we're anxiously trying to make it all happen. But because Jesus felt it appropriate to rest after he was finished, we can be confident that we need do nothing else to have all of our to be made right. Right? So there's I think a confidence that's expected in this day of death. That the work needed to do that inner healing between us and others, between us and ourselves, between us and God, is done by Jesus. And by meditating on his work on our behalf, the things that he accomplished for us, we will increasingly sense that sense of wholeness and peace and stillness and rest.
I think you've nailed it. I think that's exactly what we're inviting people into is confidence.
Yeah.
Think about the gift of the Sabbath, the law of the Sabbath for the Jewish people. They were told to do no work. So like when they were out in the wilderness, they were to gather food, except on the Sabbath.
Right.
They were to gather enough for 2 days, but then they weren't to gather anything the next day. And they were to trust that God would provide.
Yeah.
They didn't need to stockpile.
They didn't.
So it took a confidence in God's provision to allow for rest in the moment.
That's right.
I think the same way when I lay down to bed, when any of us go to bed at night, when any of us lay down to rest, we need some sense of confidence. It's like why I have a hard time sleeping on like planes.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not confident that like the cart's not going to hit me down the aisle, or that I'm not going to drool on the person next to me, or like we need a sense of safety and confidence. It's why like I have a ritual. I got to go around and lock my doors in my house before going to bed. Some people set alarms.
Right. You don't fall asleep in places that you don't feel safe. Yeah.
That's right.
That's right.
And so rest requires confidence.
Yes.
And I think Jesus, let's talk about it from his point of view for a second. Like Jesus was confident in the power of the Father that he could lay down his life because he knew that God would bring it up again.
Yeah.
He could enter into the rest of death because he was confident in the power of God.
Yes. David's forefather, or not David's forefather, Jesus' forefather, King David, said exactly this in Psalm 16. He said, "My heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body will also rest in hope."
Rest in hope.
In hope.
Rest in confidence.
Because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead.
Wow.
And you will not let your Holy One see decay. What I think he's talking about there is his confidence that even after he dies, God will continue his kingly lineage and one of his sons will reign after him.
Yeah.
Right? He's like, even though my body might die, the lineage of David will live forever. I'm confident of this. I will always be a son of David.
Right. And so Jesus, the ultimate son of David,
he does it. And what's fascinating is that God takes the metaphor of death that David is using to describe the way in which lineage is in father, son happens.
Right.
And turns it into reality.
Right.
I won't just provide you an unbroken lineage.
Which I've done in Jesus.
You can trace his genealogy in the book of Matthew if you'd like. I've also given you the metaphor, actual life from the actual dead.
That's right. Here is a body in the tomb which everybody expects will see decay.
Yes.
But I'm going to make Psalm 16 true and show you that God's ultimate Holy One will not see decay, nor will I abandon him to the grave.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And that kind of rest, takes so much confidence and trust in God. Right. It's like, how can we love? Go back to Maundy Thursday for a second.
Yeah.
When we've been given a new command to love others as Jesus has loved us. What allows us to lay down our lives for others? It's trust and confidence that that's not going to be for naught.
Right.
Like that we're not going to be walked all over, but that Jesus will bring good out of our little deaths.
Yeah. And think about it just more with a little bit more point on it. A lot of people are on the verge of dying.
Right. Yes.
And so there's a confidence that they need as they approach the final years and final days of their life.
Right.
Everyone will sleep. So Black Friday invites us to remind, we will all die.
We will all die. Yeah.
Jesus died. We will all die.
Right.
But how do we approach that death? And we approach that death in confidence, like Jesus did. The work has been finished, and death ultimately always leads to resurrection.
Yeah, it's so good. So I think then with that clarity, what we're offering to people today, what Holy Saturday, Black Saturday, what the rest of Jesus in the tomb is offering to people today is to lay down your anxiety because you can have confidence that everything you need to be right with God, to live even though you die physically, right? To know that you're saved.
Yeah.
Everything that you need to have confidence in those truths has been accomplished on Good Friday. Like it is finished. The work is done. Rest. Put your anxiety and your self-performance down and know that you can take it easy. You don't have to earn anything else.
You can be confident that God has done all that God on your behalf has done all that you need to do in order to be with him.
Yeah. And so I think that's the invitation today.
Yeah.
Which is cool too, from a meta point, to say on a day of death,
right?
A day that Jesus laid in the tomb, a day of hopelessness,
right,
for anybody who was believing in him.
Yeah.
Jesus is actually inviting us into a great deal of restful life.
Yeah. Hope in death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will. What's Psalm 16 say? I will
rest in hope.
Rest in hope.
I will die in hope.
That's it. Rest in hope.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're being inviting into today. Yeah. Rest in hope. That's good. Okay. Well, that's Black Saturday, Holy Saturday.
That's right.
Tomorrow,
Easter Sunday.
Resurrection Sunday.
Resurrection
Sunday. So exciting. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow on our last day of this journey, the resurrection of Jesus on Easter. Well, welcome everybody to Resurrection Sunday. We've made it through 8 of these podcasts.
That's right.
We're very excited. It's been awesome going through all of these.
I know it's been fun doing this shorter kind of quick fire format.
Yeah. So we're thankful for those of you who have kind of been through all 8 days of Holy Week with us, or for those of you who are just joining us, welcome.
Welcome.
For a lot of people, Resurrection Sunday is the one they're going to listen to.
That's right.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, this is the day that Jesus rose from the dead.
Let's go.
And we're going to talk about it. This is the reason anybody anywhere is a Christian.
Yes, that's right. If he wasn't, we would be pitied above all men.
I was trying to phrase this in the most blunt way as possible. It's like there once was a Jewish man, first century Jewish man, who is the only person in human history to have died and then risen from the dead. Mm-hmm. And during his life, he claimed to be the king over everything and to be God himself. And then he proved it by raising from the dead.
Right.
That's why I'm a Christian.
Yes.
And I'm like, that specificity was helpful for me in a way I haven't thought about in a while. I'm like, a first century Jewish man claimed he was God and then proved it by rising from the dead. That's why I think he's the king. Yep. And that's why I live my life according to his laws.
Right. Yeah. Someone asked me pretty recently, why are you a Christian?
Yeah.
Or why do you believe in God, or any of those kind of apologetic based questions. And they all come back to this day for me.
Right.
It's because Jesus rose from the dead.
Right.
I believe in that historical fact.
Yes.
And everything hinges on that. And I think the apostles agree. When you talk about, or when you look at the ministry of the early church in Acts, what they focus on most is the resurrection and ascension of Jesus.
Yes.
As proof positive of the gospel message.
Yes.
It's not Good Friday, although they talk about it. It's not, but it's Resurrection Sunday.
It is fascinating, and it completes the story that we began on Palm Sunday, where Jesus rides into Jerusalem like a rival king and a rival high priest, coming to tear down and build a new kingdom and build a new temple in himself. And on Resurrection Sunday, he proves he has the authority to claim the destruction of those things.
Yep.
And he actually is what he claimed to be. He is actually the king who could bring life from death. He is actually the king who's the new temple offering forgiveness through his body and the new sacrifice that gives life to all people. He is everything he's claimed to be.
Right. On Resurrection Sunday, Jesus proves he is who he said he was.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
I like that.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. I think a lot of times we're already starting to reframe a bit of Easter, a bit of Resurrection Sunday from what people probably tend to normally associate with this day. And I'm not saying those normal associations are bad.
Right.
But normally what I would hear on an Easter sermon is death is defeated.
Yeah, and
which
that
is
true.
Some of the best news on planet Earth. Not belittling that in any way. And it's 100% true. But what we've been tracking through Holy Week, Jesus wasn't talking a lot about what he was going to do to death, What he was talking about was, and what he was demonstrating was that he has the authority to be the king of his people and of all nations. Mm-hmm. And so what we're going to try to focus in on today, I think, as we look at Resurrection Sunday in light of all of Holy Week, is resurrection as the enthronement of a king.
Mm-hmm. That's
okay.
Right. Yes.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
The Sunday morning comes.
Yeah.
And women arrive at the tomb.
Yeah. And they see the stone has been rolled away.
Yeah.
And they walk inside. There's an angel there, a young man, depending on your translation, and he says, he is not here.
Yeah.
He is risen. Go and tell the disciples.
Right, which is a really good formula to remember because it's going to get repeated several times.
Yeah.
That he's not here. Or he is risen.
He is risen.
Go and tell.
Go and tell.
Yeah.
And that is really interesting to keep in mind as I was studying for this day. It's like that's kind of the thrust of everything that happens after this point. Jesus will appear and the disciples go and tell.
Yep. And so let's back up real quick and just give a little historical background to why that formula is so important.
Okay.
Because it follows what was the traditional way that kings were enthroned in the time of Rome.
Okay.
So a king, like a new Caesar, would be enthroned, and as soon as that would happen, a proclamation would go out.
A gospel.
Exactly. A gospel. A euangelion would go out. That is where the term came from. That was the news of an enthroned king. I have a euangelion. Caesar Augustus has taken the throne.
Yes.
So a king is enthroned, and the gospel goes out to all the inhabited lands that Caesar Augustus is king. But now there is a dead Jewish man who's risen from the grave, and there's a new gospel being proclaimed that he is king of the whole world, and all authority has been given to him. Therefore, go and tell that Jesus is king. Like
it's big deal.
That's the message that's happening.
Deal.
So we talked about on Good Friday. We talked about the cross as a type of kingly enthronement. Right? Jesus gets a crown, he gets a royal robe, he gets a scepter, and he's raised up on the cross like a king would be raised up onto a throne. And what was tinged on that day with irony and sarcasm, mockery, because it was a crown, but it was a crown of thorns. Right?
Yeah.
It was a throne, but it was really a cross. Today, all of those foreshadows are made real. Yeah. So Jesus rises from the dead. How is that a kingly enthronement? Why are we talking about kingship, ascension?
Right.
Why are we talking about those topics in resurrection if people are unfamiliar with this idea?
Well, I think the reason why we're talking about it is because that's the story that Jesus has been telling and the gospel writers have been telling up to this point.
Yeah.
And so it's been leading the crucifixion as this type of coronation enthronement ceremony. But he dies. So you need a point where like, okay, but if the king is dead, that means the powers that be are the most powerful in the land.
Yep.
The way you know how powerful a king is by the strength and power of the enemies they defeat.
Right.
He claimed to be a king.
Yep.
And then Rome and the religious establishment proved they were more powerful than him.
They had the bigger stick.
Yep. So what then? So when Jesus rises from the dead, and why that's significant, I think we've talked about it a few times here, is like death is a weapon.
Right.
It's the tool of empires. It's the tool of establishments to coerce behavior or to make people conform.
Right.
So they use the one weapon, the biggest weapon they have, killing people. They use it, and it doesn't work.
Yep.
So if you have a king, a rival king,
who can't die,
he is more powerful than you.
Right, because every king has lost the war against death.
Every king has lost the war against death. And every other empire that gets another king to die wins and takes over their kingdom.
Until they die.
Right. But if death becomes irrelevant.
Right. If it's no longer the threat against the kingdom.
Then that king must rule forever.
Everything forever.
That's right.
He wins.
Hands down.
Yeah.
And that's why this is it's a vindication of everything he said and proof positive that he is the king over all empires and powers.
Right, because in the resurrection, he is the king who went to war against death and won.
That's right.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So what happens after the women see Jesus and are told to go and tell? What else do we need to focus on for this day?
They go and tell the disciples who come and look for themselves. When they don't believe the women, but when it's confirmed to them, they get kind of freaked out and they start telling other people to some extent. And then that pattern keeps getting repeated. Jesus appears to 500 people. He appears to 11. He appears to 12 disciples. He appears to a whole bunch of people.
Right.
Proving that He is everything that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and so there's this formula that continues where people hear the message that Jesus is risen, and then they go and tell. Right? They hear the news that the king has taken the throne, and they go and proclaim that gospel.
Yes, and the best place to kind of just land this plane is the very end of Matthew's gospel, Matthew 28.
Which is days later, right?
Days later.
Yeah.
But it's the Jesus resurrected from the dead. He's done his appearing ministry after his death. But he sums it up when he's speaking to his disciples, and he says, he makes a kingly claim. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them into my death and teaching them my ways. That's the way the Gospel of Matthew ends. It's the announcement that God is king over all things and that the world is being invited into his kingdom to abide by his laws and his ways.
Yeah. I mean, it is amazing that claim when you put political and kingly lenses on, and he says all authority, every throne, every dynasty, every empire, every little country, all authority has been given to me, right? On earth, but also in heaven.
Yes.
He is king of kings of kings of kings.
Yeah. And there's a sense in which like God is giving his divine power.
Yeah.
I mean, God and Jesus are the same, but there's a sense in which like Jesus is being given the authority on earth because he's triumphed over it.
Right.
He must be given it. No one can defeat him. He's been given authority.
Right.
But God is also giving him the throne at his right hand to rule with him. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he's the king, but a king without citizens isn't really a king.
Right.
That's just a loner with some land.
Yeah.
That's a loner with land. That's not a king.
Right.
You need citizens. You need people under you, subjects.
Yeah.
And I think you can also, in the same way that you can see the power of a king by the kinds of enemies he overcomes, you can also see the effectiveness or the wisdom of a king by the effectiveness of his citizens. Like how judicious is he in creating a just society?
Yeah, that's right.
Like are his citizens good people?
Right. Yeah.
You know, like what are they doing? And so it is cool. He says, "Okay, I got all authority. I'm the king of kings. I'm the one. Now go." And he gives a citizen commission to his people. And so much is happening in that moment.
A lot's happening.
A lot is happening. On one level, you have the commission from the Garden of Eden finally coming back. Adam and Eve were told to be fruitful and multiply. Yeah. And they failed at that mission, and we've been failing since.
Yeah.
And now we can be fruitful and multiply again, but not just through biology, but now we can tell the good news about Jesus and invite all nations, not just Jews, into this new multi-ethnic family of Jesus.
And another way that story is elevated is in the Garden of Eden. God was with Adam and Eve.
Right.
He walked with them, but when Jesus says, all authority has been given to me, and I am with you always.
Right.
He's not just with his disciples in an analogous way he was to Adam and Eve, where he was separate from them.
Yeah.
Right. He lives in his disciples.
Yeah.
The Garden of Eden travels with them.
Wow.
They are, Peter says, they're living stones of a new temple, and wherever they go and make new disciples, new temples, new gardens are being constructed.
And then you know a little bit more about this than I do because you taught it to me, so let me just tee you up for it. There's something else really interesting happening in Matthew 28 and the Great Commission, Jesus sending, is Jesus is repeating what happened at the end of Chronicles too, the end of the Hebrew Bible. Talk about that, because that's really fascinating.
Yeah, the very last words of the book of 2 Chronicles, which is the very last words of the Hebrew ordering of what we call the Old Testament, is King Cyrus proclaiming that the Jewish people should leave exile and go back to their homeland and rebuild their temple. And he basically says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and rebuild your temple.
Right.
So Matthew
is riffing on that.
And Jesus says the same thing. I am the king sending out my people to build a new temple in all the earth.
It's so cool.
And so he's completing, and then another way to say that is he's completing the history of God's people, or continuing it into a new era.
Right.
We are God's new phase of his people, bringing about his kingdom, bringing about his temple in all the earth.
And so now, so then Jesus gives that commission, right?
Yeah.
And then he ascends, right? And I think that is so important.
Flies up in the clouds.
Right, because I think that's all people think about is
Right.
like, whoa, cool, magic trick. Or
Right.
it's like, no, what's most important here is that he's taking his throne.
That's right.
An ascent in this context is a coronated and crowned king going to take his throne and begin his reign.
That's right.
And so when Jesus ascends, he's beginning his reign.
Yeah.
And so now, and that reign has extended to this point today, that Jesus still reigns. He still has all authority. And now we are his sent citizens, completing and continuing the story of his people that he's been telling from the beginning.
Yeah.
We get to go hear that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and we get to proclaim the good news that he is king.
That's right.
So we're continuing the story that began on Resurrection Sunday.
Yeah.
We heard that he is risen, and we tell the good news.
Feeding into a little bit of the other themes we're talking about is like the necessity of death in providing life. In that mission, we're also given a confidence that we're not given guarantees it'll be easy,
right?
But we are given confidences that even if that mission ends in our death brings new life.
Right.
Like our lives are generatively fruitful even when we die.
Right.
Or even as we die, sacrificing ourselves for others.
Yeah.
So there's no sense in which this Christian mission, this going and telling, can fail.
Right.
Because even the death of people proclaiming the gospel is another way the gospel is proclaimed.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. That's really good. And I think it would be really appropriate for us to land the plane here on the final resurrection. There will be a final day of resurrection.
Yes.
There will be a resurrection Sunday. I don't know if it'll happen on a Sunday, but there will be a resurrection day when Jesus, the King, comes back.
Yeah.
Right?
He comes back to earth.
Comes back to earth, and all the dead will be raised. And we will live in his kingdom forever. Those who have put their fealty toward King Jesus will be brought into his kingdom to live with him forever.
And that kingdom built on the precept of life rather than death, where healing and miracle wine and life from the dead was the thing of his ministry, will be our reality forever.
Yeah,
like the special incidents that we get, like, he made water from wine?
Right.
No, that's the normal reality.
Just go down to that river. It's full of wine. Yeah, that's amazing. And so I think that's also what Resurrection Sunday kind of just like pulls me towards.
It's like, oh, this will happen for real one day soon.
That I'll get a Resurrection Sunday.
Yeah.
It's not just something I look back to.
Yeah.
It's something I look forward to. Like, it's something that I actually get to join in on.
Yeah.
That I'm like, even though I die, I will be raised. And when I open my eyes, I'm going to see Jesus, my King, in this new resurrected world. Like, and that's another thing. Like, the world,
right? Creation
will experience a Resurrection Sunday.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's just so much
you could keep going
to go on, but it's just so good. I've loved this journey through Holy Week, and I think what I'm taking away from it. Be curious what you're taking away from it too. I think what I'm taking away from it is just how soaked in kingship this week is.
Yeah,
that Jesus wants to claim authority over all the rival kingdoms and religious establishments that I think are better, or that we think will save us, or that we want to trust in. And he claims authority over them and shows how they're insufficient, and is calling us to put all our trust and confidence in him, his upside down kingdom, his death, and his resurrection.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you take? Anything else? What do you?
That was a big thing, and then I think there's smaller things like throughout. I'm like, oh, the mercy seat.
Yeah.
Caiaphas would have gone to the mercy seat and offer anyway, like smaller things like that, which we talked about throughout. But I was really impacted and helped by this idea that Jesus has been proclaiming to be a king for a whole week, intentionally causing his own death so that he could be proven to be the king of life and death, more powerful than anything in the world.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Well, that has been Holy Week. 8 days.
8 days.
8 days. It's been really awesome. Happy Easter, everybody. Happy Resurrection Sunday.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this.
Thank you so much.
If this is your first exposure to Spoken Gospel or the Spoken Gospel podcast, we release free content all the time. We have introductions to every book of the Bible. We have devotional teachings on every chapter of Scripture. And then Seth and I sit down and have podcasts like this, going deep into different sections and books of the Bible. So we invite you to check it out on spokengospel.com, Spoken Gospel Podcast, or wherever. All the places.
And if you joined us halfway through this Holy Week podcasting mini-series, next week we'll be posting all of these episodes together in one video and on one audio format.
So you can binge it.
Binge it if you desire.
Yes. So thank you guys for joining us on Resurrection Sunday, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Spoken Gospel Podcast. Spoken Gospel creates short films, devotionals, and podcasts like this one. Everything we make is free because of generous supporters like you. To see our resources, visit spokengospel.com or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. See you next time.